By 323 BCE, the empire of Alexander the Great spanned from Macedonia in the west to the Indus River in the east, encompassing diverse populations and vast, previously autonomous regions. Following Alexander's death in Babylon, the absence of a clear successor triggered immediate political instability. Alexander had left no legitimate adult heir. His half-brother Philip III Aridius was mentally incapacitated, and his posthumous son, Alexander IV, was an infant. Contemporary sources, including Diodorus Siculus and Justin, document how the Macedonian generals, later termed the Diadochi, quickly divided the empire into satrapies to maintain nominal control. Babylon became a focal point of authority, yet loyalty among satraps was highly contingent, often shifting according to immediate military or political advantage. Seleucus, a Macedonian officer of relatively modest status under Alexander, initially received the satrapy of Babylon in 321 BCE following the partition of Triparadisus. Archaeological evidence from cuneiform tablets in Babylon demonstrates the continuity of local administration, indicating that Seleucus' early governance relied heavily on pre-existing bureaucratic networks rather than immediate Hellenization. Records indicate that temple officials and scribes maintained tax rolls and ration distributions, suggesting that the satrap's authority was both mediated and constrained by local institutions. These early measures reveal the practical challenges of asserting control over a region with established political and religious hierarchies. The immediate post-Alexandrian period was marked by fluctuating alliances and military confrontations. Antigonus Monophthalmus, controlling Phrygia and large portions of Anatolia, sought to dominate the western satrapies. According to Arrian and the Babylonian chronicles, Seleucus faced temporary expulsion by Antigonus' forces, retreating to Egypt under the protection of Ptolemy I. This exile, though brief, illustrates the precarious balance of power among the Diadochi and underscores how geography shaped strategic decisions. The Tigris and Euphrates river systems, for example, provided both defensive barriers and logistical challenges for armies maneuvering across Mesopotamia, limiting Antigonus' rapid occupation and enabling Seleucus to plan his return. By 312 BCE, Seleucus successfully reclaimed Babylon with Ptolemaic support, an event recorded in Babylonian economic documents and later commemorated as the beginning of the Seleucid era. The administrative restoration involved reaffirming local priestly authority, repairing temples damaged during military skirmishes, and re-establishing taxation systems. Archaeologists uncovered inscriptions at Babylon and Seleucia on the Tigris that document royal decrees and public works, demonstrating that Seleucus' initial consolidation relied as much on institutional legitimacy as on military might. This approach reflects an early understanding that long-term stability required integration with established social structures rather than the imposition of Greek settlers alone. Strategically, Seleucus' initial period in Babylon set precedents for the governance model of the entire Seleucid Empire. By combining Macedonian military authority with continuity in local administration, he maintained both coercive and consensual control. Economic and logistical considerations also informed policy. Babylon's position along trade routes connecting the Mediterranean with Persia and India made it essential to secure both taxation networks and local cooperation. Records indicate that Seleucus prioritized these measures alongside fortification projects, demonstrating an early synthesis of military, economic, and administrative planning. This transition from satrapal appointment under a fractured Macedonian framework to autonomous imperial authority demonstrates how leadership and geography jointly influenced the emergence of Hellenistic states. Interpretively, it highlights three systemic dynamics. First, the necessity of balancing Greek and local governance. Second, the role of established bureaucracies in stabilizing newly conquered territories. And third, the strategic advantage provided by Mesopotamia's riverine geography in resisting external threats. Archaeological discoveries and textual evidence together suggest that Seleucus' initial consolidation was deliberate, methodical, and fundamentally shaped by the structures he inherited. By the end of this formative period, Babylon had become not only a military stronghold, but also a center of administration and commerce under Seleucid oversight. The foundations of the Seleucid state were thus established amid a complex interplay of inherited bureaucratic networks, regional loyalties, and military strategy. These early years in Mesopotamia illustrate the systematic processes through which a single satrap transformed from a regional administrator into the architect of one of the largest Hellenistic empires. With the stability of Babylon secured, Seleucus could begin expanding his authority into surrounding territories, setting the stage for the emergence of the Seleucid Empire as a dominant political entity in the post-Alexandrian world. Between 320 and 305 BCE, Seleucus I Nicator transformed from a regional satrap into the architect of a Hellenistic empire. Initially appointed as the satrap of Babylon following the partition of Triparadisus in 321 BCE, Seleucus faced immediate threats from powerful rivals among the Diadochi. Antigonus Monophthalmus, who had consolidated authority in Asia Minor and Syria, sought to dominate the eastern satrapies. According to Diodorus Siculus and the Babylonian Chronicles, Seleucus was forced into temporary exile in 316 BCE, seeking refuge under the protection of Ptolemy I in Egypt. During this period, Seleucus solidified alliances, refined his strategic planning, and studied administrative models that would later inform the structure of his empire. In 312 BCE, Seleucus returned to Babylon with Ptolemaic support, an event chronicled in Babylonian economic tablets and inscriptions. These records document his immediate efforts to restore civic order. Temple complexes were repaired, canals and irrigation systems were maintained, and local administrative offices were reorganized to ensure continuity in tax collection and public works. Archaeologists have uncovered inscriptions detailing these restoration projects, demonstrating Seleucus' approach to governance as both pragmatic and systematic. Rather than imposing a purely Macedonian model, he incorporated Mesopotamian traditions of administration and priestly authority, balancing Greek military control with local institutional structures. Seleucus' military acumen became evident in subsequent campaigns that consolidated his authority across Mesopotamia, Persia, and the eastern satrapies. The Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, a decisive confrontation among the Diadochi, confirmed his position as one of the three primary successors to Alexander's empire. Seleucus' strategic deployment of phalanxes and cavalry, coordinated with allies Lysimachus and Cassander, allowed him to neutralize Antigonus' ambitions in the west. Inscriptions from the region indicate that following Ipsus, Seleucus claimed territories stretching from the Tigris to the Iranian plateau, establishing a territorial base that would underpin decades of Seleucid rule. Following Ipsus, Seleucus faced the task of extending his authority into the eastern provinces, a process complicated by local resistance and geographic obstacles. Archaeological evidence from Bactria and Media indicates the continued presence of Greek military colonies, strategically positioned along trade and communication routes. Seleucus established administrative frameworks in these regions, appointing trusted Greek and local officials to govern satrapies, while retaining ultimate control through garrisoned forces. This integration of military, administrative, and local governance structures reflects a sophisticated understanding of statecraft that prioritized both coercion and collaboration. In 281 BCE, Seleucus' eastern campaigns culminated in the Battle of Corupedium against Lysimachus, whose death secured Seleucid dominance over Asia Minor and reinforced Seleucus' position as a preeminent Hellenistic ruler. Contemporary sources, including Justin and later Appian, describe the transfer of territories and the consolidation of control over strategically vital regions, including Lydia, Cappadocia, and parts of Anatolia. The victory at Corupedium not only expanded Seleucid territory but also demonstrated the effectiveness of combined military and diplomatic strategies, highlighting the importance of both battlefield prowess and alliance management in Hellenistic state formation. Seleucus' consolidation of power had broader economic and administrative implications. The integration of Persian and Mesopotamian satrapies into a coherent imperial framework allowed for the standardization of taxation, coinage, and trade regulation. Archaeological evidence from Babylonian and Susa tablet archives shows coordinated collection of tribute and the continuation of local religious practices, indicating a deliberate effort to maintain legitimacy through established social institutions. Seleucus coinage, featuring royal imagery and inscriptions in both Greek and local scripts, further reinforced political authority while facilitating commercial activity across the empire's extensive trade networks. From a structural perspective, Seleucus' rise illustrates three critical systemic dynamics of Hellenistic empire building. First, military capability alone was insufficient. Administrative organization and local integration were essential for long-term stability. Second, the interplay between Greek and local traditions enabled Seleucid governance to be both flexible and resilient. Third, strategic alliances and opportunistic diplomacy allowed Seleucus to navigate the volatile political landscape created by the fragmentation of Alexander's empire. Together, these factors demonstrate how Seleucus combined tactical skill, institutional adaptation, and political acumen to construct a durable imperial framework. By the end of this formative period, Seleucus had transformed Babylon from a contested satrapy into the nucleus of a Hellenistic empire spanning thousands of kilometers. His military victories, administrative reforms, and strategic alliances not only ensured survival in a highly competitive political environment, but also established the Seleucid realm as a principal power alongside the Ptolemaic and Antigonid kingdoms. With his empire established, Seleucus now faced the challenge of governing an expanse larger than Alexander's had ever been in duration, setting the stage for the development of Seleucid political structures, urban centers, and cultural integration that would define the dynasty for the next 2 centuries. Following his consolidation of Babylon and eastern territories, Seleucus I Nicator embarked on a program of urban and administrative reform that would define the Seleucid state. Between 311 and 300 BCE, he established a network of cities, including Antioch on the Orontes, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Apamea. These urban centers served multiple purposes. They acted as administrative hubs, garrisoned military forces, and facilitated the diffusion of Hellenistic culture across formerly Achaemenid lands. Archaeological surveys and excavations at Antioch and Seleucia demonstrate deliberate urban planning, incorporating Greek-style grid layouts, agoras, theaters, and temples, while also accommodating local topography and traditions. Such urban initiatives reflect a systematic approach to governance, where settlement patterns reinforced both political authority and cultural integration. Coins minted in newly founded cities reveal another dimension of Seleucus statecraft. Silver tetradrachms bearing his portrait alongside symbolic imagery of Greek and Eastern deities, such as Zeus and local Mesopotamian gods, provided a tangible link between monarchy, religion, and economy. Inscriptions from these urban centers document civic offices held by Greek settlers and local elites, indicating a bureaucratic system that combined Macedonian administrative norms with existing regional structures. By embedding Greek cultural elements within local frameworks, Seleucus ensured that loyalty was both cultivated and institutionalized. This integration of settlers and indigenous populations exemplifies the practical mechanisms through which Hellenistic rulers maintained control over expansive and culturally diverse territories. Seleucus' adoption of dual titles, including Hellenic epithets such as Basilius and Persian designations reminiscent of Achaemenid kings, demonstrates an intentional policy of cultural synthesis. Contemporary sources, including inscriptions at Babylon and Seleucia on the Tigris, indicate that these titles were employed in official decrees and ceremonial contexts to confer legitimacy across ethnic and linguistic boundaries. This approach helped stabilize newly acquired territories by signaling respect for local traditions while reinforcing the authority of the Macedonian ruler. From an administrative perspective, it also provided a unified ideological framework that underpinned taxation, military recruitment, and civic participation, effectively binding the empire's disparate regions into a coherent political entity. The establishment of cities also had strategic implications. Located along major rivers, trade routes, and frontier zones, these urban centers functioned as nodes of surveillance and defense. Seleucia on the Tigris, for example, oversaw traffic along the Tigris and the eastern trade routes leading toward Persia and India. Antioch became a central hub linking Syria with Anatolia, providing access to both military resources and economic networks. Archaeological evidence shows that fortifications, citadels, and watchtowers accompanied civilian structures, demonstrating that urban planning was inseparable from security considerations. This combination of civic and military infrastructure exemplifies Seleucus' understanding of urban settlements as instruments of state control rather than purely cultural or aesthetic projects. Economic and administrative integration extended beyond city foundations. The Babylonian and Seleucian archives record the appointment of local officials, standardized tribute collection, and coordination of regional markets. Greek settlers introduced new legal codes, civic offices, and assembly practices, which coexisted alongside traditional local governance. This dual administrative framework allowed for efficient resource extraction, the mobilization of labor, and the maintenance of order, while simultaneously legitimizing Seleucid authority in the eyes of local populations. Historians such as Granger note that this model of mixed administration became a defining characteristic of the Seleucid Empire, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to governing a multi-ethnic empire over vast distances. 3 interpretive observations emerge from this period. First, Seleucus' urban program illustrates how city building served as a direct instrument of political control and cultural integration. Second, the dual use of Greek and Persian symbols in coins, inscriptions, and titles reflects a deliberate policy of ideological accommodation designed to sustain loyalty. Third, the combination of military, economic, and civic infrastructure in urban settlements exemplifies the practical mechanisms through which Hellenistic rulers projected authority over both core and peripheral regions. Together, these factors show that Seleucus reforms were foundational not only for immediate stability but also for the institutional longevity of the Seleucid state. By the end of this period, the framework of the Seleucid Empire was firmly in place. Cities acted as administrative, military, and cultural nodes, linking Greek settlers and local elites in a shared system of governance. Royal titles, coinage, and civic institutions reinforced both legitimacy and continuity, ensuring that the empire could endure the pressures of distance, diversity, and ongoing military challenges. As the Seleucid state took shape, its durability would depend on balancing Greek ideals with Eastern realities, setting the stage for the expansion and consolidation that would define the Hellenistic world for the next century. Order, not chaos, defined the new empire's foundations. From the early 3rd century BCE, Seleucus I and his successors undertook one of the most ambitious administrative reorganizations of the post-Alexandrian world. Building on both Macedonian and Achaemenid precedents, the Seleucid state established a multi-tiered bureaucracy that governed from the Aegean coast to the Hindu Kush. The satrapy system, long a feature of Persian administration, was retained, but now refined and monitored through a centralized royal apparatus. The Seleucid monarchy fused Macedonian ideals of personal kingship with institutionalized oversight, ensuring that local autonomy operated within clear imperial boundaries. Archaeological archives from Dur Europos, along with Greek and Aramaic inscriptions from Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, reveal the extent of this administrative integration. Satraps, or regional governors, oversaw taxation, military recruitment, and judicial affairs, yet their authority was constrained by royal officials known as episkopoi and strategoi. These agents acted as the eyes and ears of the central government, transmitting reports to the royal court. The Seleucid kings, unlike their Macedonian predecessors, maintained permanent chancelleries staffed by Greek-speaking scribes, often trained in the bureaucratic traditions of the Near East. Tablets and decrees discovered in Babylon and Susa record these scribes' functions, detailing the collection of agricultural surplus, temple revenues, and customs duties, evidence of a fiscal system that combined Persian regularity with Greek organizational form. Seleucus I's innovations extended to the standardization of coinage and measurement. The introduction of royal mints in Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Sardis facilitated both taxation and trade, allowing silver tetradrachms to circulate throughout the empire. Numismatic evidence shows consistent weight standards, suggesting centralized control over monetary policy. This economic integration reinforced political unity, ensuring that distant provinces remained tied to royal authority through financial dependence. The historian Polybius later observed that Seleucid currency and taxation formed the sinews of imperial power, a statement supported by modern archaeological findings indicating coordinated mint output across several key cities. In administrative terms, the Seleucid state functioned as a hierarchy of layered responsibilities. At the base were village and city councils, often composed of Greek settlers and local notables, who managed civic works and collected taxes. Above them, district officials supervised military levies and ensured compliance with royal decrees. Satraps oversaw entire regions but were themselves accountable to the royal court, whose decisions were relayed through formal proclamations, sometimes recorded bilingually to accommodate linguistic diversity. The existence of Greek and Aramaic versions of administrative decrees from northern Syria and Babylonia underscores the pragmatic multilingualism of Seleucid governance. This adaptability allowed the empire to operate effectively across regions with varying legal and cultural traditions. Antiochus I, succeeding Seleucus in 281 BCE, refined his father's administrative architecture. He formalized the separation of civil and military authority in several provinces, preventing governors from accumulating excessive power. Records from Asia Minor indicate that strategoi commanded garrisons and managed defense, while oikonomoi handled taxation and resource allocation. This division mirrored earlier Achaemenid practices, but was executed within a distinctly Hellenistic framework, emphasizing loyalty to the king rather than hereditary office. Antiochus' reforms also included the codification of land grants to Greek settlers, who received estates in return for military service, binding local defense directly to royal land policy. The Seleucid bureaucracy operated through a combination of delegation and surveillance. Royal inspectors conducted periodic reviews of provincial governance, and correspondence between satraps and the court suggests a continuous exchange of information. Clay ceilings and papyrus fragments from Dur-Europos and Babylon record official letters bearing the king's emblem, confirming the existence of a standardized administrative protocol. Such mechanisms provided cohesion across the empire's vast geography and diverse populations, ensuring that distant governors remained accountable to central authority. 3 analytical insights characterized this administrative evolution. First, the Seleucid state exemplified bureaucratic adaptation rather than innovation. It did not create new institutions from nothing but reshaped inherited models into a more centralized and durable system. Second, its governance demonstrated the fusion of personal monarchy and impersonal bureaucracy, an equilibrium that allowed the Seleucid kings to project charisma while maintaining institutional continuity. Third, the administrative balance between autonomy and oversight prevented premature fragmentation, enabling the empire to function efficiently for over a century despite recurring wars and dynastic disputes. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence reinforces the depth of this organization. At Dur-Europos, papyri record local transactions that conform to imperial tax schedules, while inscriptions from Sardis mention decrees regulating civic boundaries and market tolls. These administrative details, though seemingly mundane, reveal the practical reach of Seleucid authority into daily life. Even temple estates, historically autonomous under Persian rule, were integrated into the Seleucid fiscal network, their revenues partly redirected to support royal projects and garrison expenditures. This shift demonstrates how the Seleucids extended control into both the economic and religious spheres without overtly dismantling existing institutions. From a systemic perspective, Seleucid administration represented a synthesis of 3 governance modes: the Persian model of regional autonomy under imperial supervision, the Macedonian tradition of king-centered authority, and the Greek civic emphasis on local participation. This synthesis created a flexible but coherent imperial machine, capable of functioning across varied terrains and populations. It ensured that decisions made in Antioch could be enacted in Bactria with predictable efficiency, mediated through standardized bureaucratic channels. By the mid-3rd century BCE, this administrative system had matured into a defining feature of Seleucid power. Governors operated within a clear hierarchy. Scribes and officials maintained consistent record-keeping. Coinage and taxation connected subjects across thousands of kilometers. The empire's endurance, spanning 2 centuries despite internal divisions, was rooted in these foundational structures. Administration alone, however, could not sustain empire. Faith, identity, and culture would need to follow, shaping the ideological and social cohesion that transformed the Seleucid realm from a bureaucratic apparatus into a civilization. Wherever a Seleucid banner flew, a city soon followed. From the early 3rd century BCE onward, the Seleucid dynasty made urbanization the primary expression of imperial power. Nearly 40 cities were founded, refounded, or reorganized under Seleucid authority, forming a lattice of administrative, military, and cultural centers stretching from the Aegean coast to the Indus frontier. Each foundation, whether Antioch in Syria, Seleucia on the Tigris in Mesopotamia, or Laodicea in Asia Minor, served as both a tool of governance and a symbol of Hellenistic identity. The historian Appian later observed that Seleucus I filled Asia with cities, a remark confirmed by archaeological and epigraphic evidence documenting deliberate, systematic expansion. Seleucid urbanization followed a clear administrative logic. Cities functioned as regional capitals, tax collection points, and logistical bases for military operations. Their placement often corresponded to strategic river crossings, fertile plains, or trade routes, reflecting both economic and defensive considerations. Antioch, founded around 300 BCE, controlled access to the Mediterranean and the routes into Anatolia. Seleucia on the Tigris, constructed near ancient Babylon, commanded the Mesopotamian heartland and replaced the older city as a political and economic hub. Excavations reveal orthogonal street grids, agora complexes, and standardized building materials, hallmarks of Greek urban design applied to Near Eastern landscapes. Yet beneath these new constructions lay older strata of Mesopotamian urbanism, indicating not replacement but superimposition, a process through which Greek planning integrated with, rather than erased, existing traditions. The physical layout of these cities embodied Seleucid ideology. Greek civic institutions, the council, boule, assembly, ecclesia, and magistracies, were introduced alongside temples, theaters, and gymnasia. These served not only as civic amenities but also as instruments of cultural transmission. Inscriptions from Antioch and Sardis record dedications by local elites adopting Greek honorific titles, suggesting an active embrace of Hellenistic forms by non-Greek populations. Theaters hosted royal festivals celebrating dynastic anniversaries, while gymnasia educated the sons of settlers and local aristocrats in Greek language and customs. These spaces created what modern historians term islands of Hellenism, where Greek civic life was reproduced and adapted within diverse cultural environments. Seleucid colonization was both demographic and ideological. Veterans from the royal army received land allotments in newly founded cities, ensuring loyalty while stabilizing frontier zones. Records indicate that these settlers were drawn from Macedonia, Thessaly, and Asia Minor, forming military civic communities that could mobilize in defense of royal authority. At the same time, local populations, Babylonians, Persians, and Syrians, were incorporated as artisans, laborers, and administrators. Archaeological layers at Dur Europos and Ai Khanum reveal this cultural fusion. Greek architectural layouts combined with Eastern decorative motifs, bilingual inscriptions, and hybrid religious iconography. Such evidence demonstrates that Seleucid colonization was not a one-way imposition of culture, but a negotiated synthesis producing distinctive urban identities. Economic integration accompanied this urban growth. Each city acted as a node within an expansive commercial network linking the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Coinage minted at urban centers circulated across the empire, carrying the royal image and standardizing transactions. Market inscriptions from Seleucia and Apamea document the regulation of trade tolls and grain storage, reflecting organized economic oversight. Ports such as Seleucia Pieria extended Seleucid influence into maritime trade, connecting Syrian and Anatolian hinterlands to Mediterranean markets. The combination of inland and coastal cities created a layered infrastructure that enabled efficient taxation and troop deployment across immense distances. 3 interpretive observations emerge from the evidence. First, the Seleucid urban program represented the most sustained effort at territorial integration in the Hellenistic world. By embedding administration within city networks, rather than isolated garrisons, the dynasty ensured a durable presence across heterogeneous regions. Second, cities functioned as vectors of Hellenization, not through coercion, but through shared civic life, education, and ritual. Greek became the lingua franca of administration and commerce, spreading alongside standardized institutions and coinage. Third, the archaeological hybridity of Seleucid cities underscores that empire was constructed as much through adaptation as through expansion. The combination of Greek urban form and Near Eastern substance produced civic cultures that were local in practice yet imperial in orientation. Seleucid cities also projected royal ideology into daily experience. Statues, inscriptions, and temples celebrated the dynasty's divine ancestry, linking rulers to Zeus, Apollo, and local deities. Civic calendars marked royal birthdays and military victories, transforming urban space into a stage for dynastic ritual. At Antioch, annual processions honoring the Seleucid founder blended Greek athletic contests with Persian ceremonial display. These spectacles reaffirmed loyalty while naturalizing imperial authority, demonstrating how infrastructure served as a medium of both governance and symbolism. By the mid-3rd century BCE, the Seleucid urban network had matured into a functioning imperial system. Cities collected taxes, quartered armies, minted coins, and diffused cultural norms. They embodied the physical and ideological coherence of a realm that stretched over 4,000 kilometers. Archaeological remains, from street grids in Syria to Greek inscriptions in Iran, attest to the deliberate orchestration of empire through settlement. The Seleucid world was thus not a loose federation of provinces but a connected landscape of cities, each a microcosm of Hellenistic civilization adapted to its environment. The empire's physical network enabled a deeper, spiritual, and cultural integration yet to unfold, as Seleucid rulers turned their attention to the challenge of forging shared religious and intellectual traditions across this vast, diverse domain. In temples from Syria to Susa, the gods themselves bore witness to a new synthesis. Religion in the Seleucid Empire was not a matter of private devotion but a foundation of public order. The early Seleucid kings, inheriting both the Macedonian tradition of divine kingship and the Achaemenid legacy of sacral monarchy, used religion as a tool of legitimacy. Seleucus I and his successors presented themselves as favored by the Olympian gods, yet they also assumed ritual roles once held by the great kings of Persia. Their rule fused Hellenistic theology with Mesopotamian piety, producing a political theology suited to a vast and multi-ethnic empire. The Greek custom of ruler cult, where living kings were venerated as divinely chosen or semi-divine, provided the Seleucids with a flexible model of divine kingship. Coins from the reign of Seleucus I depict him with the attributes of Zeus, while later issues under Antiochus I portray the king wearing a horned diadem reminiscent of Alexander's iconography. Yet the Seleucid approach went beyond imitation. In the eastern satrapies, Seleucid rulers participated in ancient local rites, including sacrifices at Babylon's Esagila temple dedicated to Marduk. Cuneiform tablets from the early 3rd century BCE record the restoration of temple privileges and priestly endowments under Seleucus I, indicating that the dynasty sought recognition not through suppression, but through partnership with established priesthoods. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms this deliberate religious diplomacy. The Babylonian astronomical diaries mention royal offerings made during Seleucid reigns, blending Greek and Mesopotamian calendrical observances. Reliefs from sites such as Nemrut Dag and Ai Khanum illustrate how Seleucid rulers combined Greek iconography with Persian and Babylonian symbols of kingship. Antiochus I, for instance, is depicted clasping hands with deities rendered in both Greek and Oriental styles, a visual expression of concord between pantheons. This artistic syncretism mirrored a political reality. Divine recognition served to unify territories long accustomed to separate cosmologies. 3 interpretive insights emerge from these practices. First, the Seleucid adoption of local cults was not simple flattery but administrative necessity. By sustaining temple economies and priestly hierarchies, the monarchy secured access to tax revenues, agricultural estates, and civic loyalty. Second, the Seleucid fusion of gods reflected an attempt to articulate universal sovereignty. by presenting Zeus and Marduk as equivalents, or Apollo and Shamash as parallel solar deities. The kings proclaimed dominion sanctioned by all heavens. Third, the religious synthesis created a shared symbolic vocabulary that transcended language and ethnicity, enabling Greek colonists, Persian nobles, and Babylonian priests to interpret royal authority within their own traditions. Antiochus I, ruling from 281 to 261 BCE, advanced this policy with unusual subtlety. He renewed temple foundations at Babylon, Uruk, and Seleucia, where inscriptions document bilingual dedications in Greek and Akkadian. In one notable example, a foundation cylinder from Borsippa records that the king restored the shrines of Nabu, according to the custom of the ancients. The phrase demonstrates a conscious invocation of Achaemenid precedent, positioning the Seleucids as lawful heirs to Persia's imperial guardianship of sacred order. Simultaneously, Antiochus built Greek-style sanctuaries in Asia Minor, dedicating altars to Apollo at Daphne and Zeus at Antioch. The coexistence of these practices, Greek temples in the west, Mesopotamian restorations in the east, exemplifies how Seleucid kingship was calibrated to regional expectations. Religious iconography reinforced this ideological balance. At Seleucia on the Tigris, terracotta figurines depict Greek deities alongside Mesopotamian motifs, such as winged genii and sacred lions. The repetition of this imagery across the empire indicates standardized production and official sanction. In Anatolia, reliefs showing kings offering libations before hybrid deities suggest that divine mediation was central to the presentation of power. The emperor was not a god among mortals but the conduit through which the gods upheld empire. This concept, inherited from the Achaemenids yet reframed in Greek visual language, allowed the Seleucids to legitimize authority across cultural frontiers without requiring theological uniformity. Such religious integration was not limited to temples or iconography. It extended into calendar and ceremony. Local priesthoods incorporated royal anniversaries into sacred timetables, while the Seleucid era, beginning in 312 BCE, provided a unified chronological framework that linked regional observances to dynastic history. This administrative use of time as a religious instrument exemplifies how deeply faith and governance intertwined. In effect, the Seleucids transformed temporal order into an expression of divine kingship. According to epigraphic evidence from Asia Minor, communities often erected altars and cult statues to living kings under the title Theos Soter, God the Savior. Such dedications paralleled civic benefactions. The king provided security and prosperity. The city reciprocated with divine honors. The political economy of worship thus mirrored the reciprocity of administration. Through benefaction, ritual, and monumental art, the Seleucid monarch became the unifying principle of empire, not merely by law but by sacral presence. By the mid-3rd century BCE, the Seleucid synthesis of religion had achieved broad acceptance. Greek and Oriental cults operated side by side, temples flourished under royal patronage, and divine imagery permeated civic life. The empire's pantheon was both plural and coherent, a reflection of imperial ideology rendered in sacred form. Religion served not as division, but as a diplomatic medium through which the Seleucid kings communicated authority to every corner of their domain. Cultural synthesis would soon extend from the sacred to the economic and military realms, as Seleucid rulers turned from temples to treasuries and garrisons in their ongoing effort to preserve the architecture of empire. Having inherited half the world, Antiochus I's first task was to keep it intact. When Antiochus I Soter ascended the Seleucid throne in 281 BCE, he inherited not a unified dominion, but a mosaic of provinces stretched across 3 continents. The death of his father, Seleucus I Nicator, at Corupedium left the empire vulnerable. To the west, the rugged lands of Asia Minor were destabilized by the migrations of Galatian tribes. To the east, the vast satrapies beyond the Zagros Mountains strained under the weight of distance and local autonomy. Antiochus' reign would thus be defined less by conquest than by the formidable task of defense, of turning Alexander's fleeting empire into a sustainable state. From the outset, Antiochus faced crises on multiple fronts. The Galatians, Celtic groups who had entered Anatolia around 278 BCE threatened the Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from the ruins of Alexander's conquests. Their raids across Phrygia and Lydia destabilized trade routes and alarmed urban centers like Sardis and Ephesus. Antiochus' decisive campaign against them, culminating in victory near Sardis, earned him the title Soter, meaning savior. Ancient sources such as Lucian and later historians report that the king employed a combination of military discipline and symbolic power, including the use of elephants, animals that had become emblems of Seleucid might since the campaigns of Seleucus I in India. This military triumph had both practical and ideological effects. It restored Seleucid prestige in Asia Minor and demonstrated that the dynasty could act as a shield for the Greek cities of the region. Archaeological findings from Sardis, including Hellenistic fortification walls and coin hoards bearing Antiochus' image, suggest renewed urban confidence in royal protection. The victory also marked the beginning of a broader defensive strategy, a reorientation of Seleucid policy from outward expansion to internal consolidation. East of the Euphrates, Antiochus confronted a different set of challenges. The vastness of the empire demanded constant negotiation with local governors and satraps, whose loyalty was often tenuous. Records from Babylon and the Seleucid administrative archives indicate that the king undertook a reorganization of eastern provinces, reinforcing strategic settlements such as Dur-Europos and Nisibis along the Tigris frontier. Excavations at these sites have revealed fortress complexes, barracks, and standardized Greek architectural elements, evidence of military colonization as an imperial instrument. These fortresses served dual purposes: defensive bastions against nomadic incursions and administrative centers projecting royal authority deep into the periphery. Three interpretive insights illuminate the nature of Antiochus' frontier defense. First, his policy represented a shift from conquest to governance. The Seleucids had inherited the momentum of Alexander's campaigns, but Antiochus recognized that the empire's survival required depth, not breadth. Second, the reliance on fortified urban centers rather than mobile field armies signaled an adaptation to geography. The rugged mountains of Anatolia and the desert margins of Mesopotamia favored defense through settlement networks rather than through perpetual warfare. Third, Antiochus' frontier management anticipated later imperial strategies, blending military presence with civic infrastructure to integrate distant populations into the Seleucid system. In Asia Minor, the establishment of garrison cities such as Apamea and Seleucia in Pisidia served to anchor Seleucid power in previously unstable regions. These foundations mirrored the dual character of the empire, Greek in design, but strategically situated within non-Greek landscapes. Inscriptions from Apamea attest to the presence of military colonists granted land in exchange for service, illustrating how settlement and defense were intertwined. The soldiers, often Macedonian veterans and their descendants, formed loyal enclaves bound by royal patronage and cultural identity. Further east, the Seleucids faced pressure from semi-independent regions like Persis and Parthia. While Antiochus avoided major eastern campaigns, contemporary Babylonian chronicles refer to the dispatch of governors with reinforced contingents to control rebellious districts. Fortresses at Dura and along the Tigris corridor were strengthened, with archaeological layers showing increased military occupation during the early 3rd century BCE. These garrisons secured not only borders but trade routes linking Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau, routes essential for the movement of tribute, troops, and information. Antiochus' defensive vision extended into logistical systems. Evidence from cuneiform economic tablets suggests that supplies of grain, horses, and arms were systematically managed through regional depots. The adaptation of Achaemenid communication networks, specifically the Royal Road, facilitated the rapid relay of orders and intelligence. The result was a militarized bureaucracy capable of responding to threats without overstretching royal resources. In this way, Antiochus continued his father's synthesis of Greek administrative rationality and Persian logistical expertise. The symbolic dimension of defense was equally significant. The epithet Soter functioned as more than mere flattery. It articulated the Seleucid conception of kingship as guardian of order. In a world fragmented after Alexander's death, Security itself became a political virtue. Antiochus' image on coinage reinforced this ideal. He is portrayed wearing a diadem, the emblem of Hellenistic monarchy, yet his gaze and bearing evoke the stability of the Persian great kings. By uniting these visual languages, Antiochus presented himself as the defender of civilization across both Greek and Eastern domains. Archaeological parallels confirm this ideology in stone. The reconstruction of temples and civic walls under Antiochus' reign often included dedicatory inscriptions invoking divine protection over both city and ruler. In this way, military defense and divine favor became inseparable in the imperial consciousness. The frontier was not a remote boundary. It was a sacred perimeter, defining the space in which the Seleucid cosmos could exist. By the close of Antiochus I's reign, the empire's borders had stabilized. The Galatian incursions were contained, the eastern provinces subdued, and the network of fortified cities established a durable skeleton of authority. Yet the cost of constant vigilance was high. Defense demanded resources that could otherwise have fueled expansion, and reliance on localized garrisons foreshadowed future regional autonomy. Still, in an age of shifting alliances and constant unrest, Antiochus' strategic restraint laid the groundwork for a century of Seleucid endurance. Once borders stabilized, Seleucid rulers turned to trade and diplomacy to bind the empire's distant lands. Beyond the Zagros Mountains, Hellenism found new soil. For the Seleucid Empire, the eastern provinces were not remote possessions. They were the backbone of wealth and legitimacy. Stretching from Media through Parthia to Bactria, these satrapies connected the empire's Mesopotamian core to the highlands and river valleys of Central Asia. Under Antiochus I and his successors, this vast region became both a frontier and a bridge, binding the Mediterranean world to the markets of India. Geography dictated policy. Whoever controlled the east controlled the arteries of trade that sustained the empire's urban centers. The Achaemenid royal road, inherited and maintained by the Seleucids, remained the empire's commercial lifeline. Beginning at Sardis and extending to Susa and beyond, it facilitated a constant flow of goods, soldiers, and information. Seleucid administrators expanded and fortified this network, establishing caravanserais and garrison towns along key junctions. Cuneiform tablets and Greek inscriptions from Ecbatana and Susa attest to standardized toll systems and royal oversight of transit routes. Through this logistical infrastructure, the Seleucids integrated economies that had once been autonomous, linking Anatolian silver, Mesopotamian grain, and Eastern textiles into a single imperial system. 3 interpretive observations define the Eastern policy of the Seleucids. First, the East served as an economic reservoir. Tribute from Media and taxation from trade across the Iranian plateau financed the royal court and the military apparatus in Syria. Second, it was a zone of cultural negotiation. Greek colonists, Persian nobles, and Central Asian elites shared urban spaces, temples, and markets, producing hybrid societies that preserved local languages while adopting Hellenic political institutions. Third, the Eastern satrapies embodied the paradox of empire, indispensable for wealth, yet increasingly difficult to control across immense distances. Archaeological discoveries at Ai Khanum, a city situated at the confluence of the Oxus and Koksha rivers, offer direct testimony to Seleucid and post-Seleucid influence in the Far East. Excavations have revealed Greek-style architecture, gymnasia, stoas, and a theater, set within a region steeped in Iranian and Central Asian traditions. Inscriptions found there, including a Delphic maxim carved in Greek script, demonstrate that Hellenic civic ideals reached deep into Afghanistan. The city's layout mirrored that of Western metropolises like Miletus or Antioch, yet its artifacts, Persian-style ceramics and Indian ivory, reveal a cosmopolitan identity shaped by trade. Ai Khanum was both Greek polis and Central Asian emporium, a frontier where the Seleucid state extended not only its armies but its culture. The Seleucids' engagement with India further enhanced their trans-regional stature. Historical sources, including Strabo and the Mauryan edicts, indicate diplomatic exchanges between Seleucus I and Chandragupta Maurya around 305 BCE. The treaty that followed ceded territories east of the Indus to the Mauryan Empire in exchange for 500 war elephants and a pledge of alliance. These elephants became a hallmark of Seleucid military power, decisive in the victory at Ipsus and emblematic of royal prestige. The agreement also opened a channel for trade and cultural exchange, linking the Hellenistic world to the Indian subcontinent through controlled crossings along the Indus frontier. The Eastern economy thrived on this connectivity. Caravans carried silk, lapis lazuli, and spices from India and Central Asia towards Seleucia, the Tigris, and Antioch, while Greek artisans and officials migrated eastward in return. Archaeological evidence of Greek coinage in Bactria and Anatolia demonstrates a robust monetary network. Coins bearing the image of Zeus on the obverse and elephants or winged victories on the reverse symbolized not only economic value but ideological reach, the image of Greek power adapted to Asian iconography. Hoards recovered near Nisa and Merv include Seleucid issues circulating well into the 2nd century BCE, illustrating the persistence of imperial influence long after central authority waned. At the administrative level, the Seleucids maintained the Achaemenid satrapal framework but introduced new forms of oversight. Satraps such as Diodotus in Bactria and Andragoras in Parthia operated with increasing autonomy, balancing loyalty to the royal court with local pragmatism. Greek inscriptions and Babylonian records reveal that these governors collected taxes, minted coins, and maintained small armies, effectively functioning as semi-independent rulers under nominal Seleucid supervision. This decentralization was both a strength and a liability. It allowed local adaptation and efficiency, but it also planted the seeds of fragmentation that would later produce the Greco-Bactrian and Parthian kingdoms. Trade routes radiating from the eastern provinces sustained the empire's fiscal core. Seleucia, the Tigris, the administrative capital founded by Seleucus I, emerged as a critical node where eastern caravans met Mediterranean shipping routes. Excavations have uncovered warehouses, standardized weights, and a dense pattern of merchant housing, indicators of extensive commercial regulation. From Seleucia, goods flowed down the Euphrates to the port of Antioch, supplying the royal court and urban populations with commodities once deemed exotic. The movement of goods was accompanied by the circulation of ideas. Buddhist influences reached the Hellenistic world through these corridors, while Greek art and architecture spread eastward, shaping the visual language of early Gandhara. The eastern satrapies also served as laboratories of imperial adaptation. In media, Greek settlers intermarried with local elites, forming hybrid aristocracies fluent in both Greek and Aramaic. Administrative tablets from Persepolis and Babylon mention bilingual scribes, illustrating the coexistence of imperial and regional bureaucracies. Religious syncretism mirrored political realities. Zeus Megistos in Greek inscriptions corresponds to Ahura Mazda in local dedications, while deities such as Mitra and Anahita found places in Hellenistic cults. This cultural convergence gave Seleucid rule a depth of legitimacy that purely military conquest could not achieve. Economically, Antiochus I and his successors capitalized on the eastern trade routes to stabilize revenue after years of warfare. The circulation of standardized silver tetradrachms ensured fiscal uniformity, while tariffs on caravan goods contributed directly to royal finances. Records indicate that toll stations were positioned along the Zagros passes and near the city of Susa, enabling the court to profit from the movement of both luxury goods and bulk commodities. The Seleucid East thus became a self-sustaining mechanism. Taxation funded fortifications and roads, which in turn facilitated trade that replenished the treasury. Yet the very success of this eastern system carried within it the potential for independence. As eastern governors amassed wealth and local armies, the gravitational pull of the central monarchy weakened. By the mid-3rd century BCE, regions like Bactria began asserting greater autonomy, their Hellenized elites identifying more with local prosperity than distant Antioch. Still, during Antiochus I's reign, the Seleucid East remained integrated through economic interdependence and cultural exchange. Beyond the Zagros, Hellenism did not merely survive, it adapted. The Seleucid East was less a frontier than a dialogue between worlds. Greek urbanism met Persian administration, Indian diplomacy, and Central Asian commerce. In that dialogue lay the empire's greatest innovation, the creation of a transcontinental economy that prefigured later Silk Road networks. Economic vitality, however, invited new rivals, none more persistent than the dynasty of the Nile. In the shadow of Alexander's memory, two heirs fought for his ghost. For more than a century, the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties contested a narrow corridor of land known as Coele-Syria, a region encompassing modern-day Lebanon, southern Syria, and parts of Palestine. What began as a border dispute became the longest and most defining rivalry of the Hellenistic world. Between 274 and 168 BCE, six conflicts known collectively as the Syrian Wars reshaped not only the political geography of the Near East but the very structure of Hellenistic diplomacy. This confrontation was rooted in inheritance. Both dynasties claimed to be the true heirs of Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies, ruling from Alexandria, embodied maritime wealth and administrative efficiency, controlling Egypt's fertile Nile Valley and its ports. The Seleucids, ruling from Antioch and Seleucia, possessed the continental empire, sprawling, resource-rich but fragile. Between them lay Coele-Syria, the strategic hinge connecting Asia Minor, the Levant, and Egypt. Whoever controlled it commanded the trade routes linking the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. The First Syrian War, 274 to 271 BCE, erupted during the reigns of Antiochus I and Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Although neither side gained decisive advantage, the conflict set a precedent for continuous hostility. Papyrus documents from the Xenon archive in Egypt mention troop movements and supply requisitions tied to campaigns along the coastal Levant, illustrating how deeply the war affected regional economies. Antiochus' efforts to recover the region faltered, hindered by simultaneous revolts in the eastern satrapies and the logistical challenge of mobilizing across multiple fronts. It was under Antiochus II Theos, 261 to 246 BCE, that the rivalry intensified. The Second Syrian War, 260 to 253 BCE, drew in Greek city-states and naval powers such as Rhodes, transforming a local contest into a Mediterranean-wide struggle. Contemporary inscriptions from Miletus record alliances with the Seleucid court, while Egyptian naval records note extensive shipbuilding at Alexandria. Both dynasties sought to project their legitimacy through control of the sea as much as through the possession of land. Three interpretive insights define the Seleucid-Ptolemaic rivalry. First, it institutionalized warfare as a mechanism of diplomacy. Treaties, marriages, and alliances alternated with campaigns, producing a cyclical model of conflict management characteristic of the Hellenistic age. Second, the wars accelerated technological innovation, especially in naval construction and siegecraft, as both sides adapted to protracted engagements. Third, the contest over Coele-Syria functioned as a symbolic theater of legitimacy, where possession of Alexander's former territories equated to possession of his legacy. The Second Syrian War culminated in a dynastic marriage meant to secure peace. Antiochus II married Berenice, daughter of Ptolemy II, while repudiating his previous wife, Laodice. The arrangement temporarily united the dynasties but collapsed after the deaths of both Ptolemy II and Antiochus II. Laodice's supporters orchestrated a coup that resulted in the deaths of Berenice and her infant son, a sequence of events recorded in the Parian marble and later dramatized by Hellenistic historians. The ensuing Third Syrian War, often called the Laodicean War, 246 to 241 BCE, reignited hostilities as Ptolemy III Euergetes invaded Syria to avenge his sister. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence corroborates the devastation of this conflict. Inscriptions from Seleucia Pieria record the rebuilding of temples and civic structures after Ptolemaic occupation, while Egyptian papyri refer to the transport of war booty from Asia Minor and Mesopotamia. The Canopus decree of Ptolemy III commemorates the king's victories and his retrieval of sacred images allegedly stolen by the Persians centuries earlier, propaganda designed to cast Egypt as the restorer of divine order against Asiatic chaos. Despite early successes, the Ptolemies were unable to sustain control over the conquered territories. Distance, local resistance, and the vastness of the Seleucid realm forced a negotiated settlement. Antiochus II's successors focused on recovering internal stability, while the Ptolemies consolidated naval dominance. Yet the pattern of alternating war and diplomacy endured. Under Antiochus III, later called the Great, the Seleucids launched a renewed effort to reclaim the Levant. The Fourth Syrian War, 219 to 217 BCE, marked the zenith of this ambition. Antiochus' forces advanced along the Phoenician coast, seizing strategic cities such as Tyre and Ptolemais. However, the campaign culminated in the Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE, one of the largest set-piece battles of the Hellenistic era. Papyrological evidence and the historian Polybius describe an engagement involving more than 120,000 troops, including war elephants on both sides. Despite his initial advantages, Antiochus suffered defeat at the hands of Ptolemy IV Philopator, demonstrating the limits of Seleucid reach and the enduring strength of Egypt's resources. Yet even defeat proved transformative. Polybius notes that the Battle of Raphia allowed tens of thousands of native Egyptians to serve in the Ptolemaic army, an event that later destabilized Egyptian control by arming a new social class. Meanwhile, Antiochus learned crucial lessons in logistics and army reform that would inform his later campaigns in the east. By the Fifth Syrian War, 202 to 195 BCE, the balance began to shift decisively. Taking advantage of Egyptian internal weakness following the death of Ptolemy IV, Antiochus III renewed his assault on Coele Syria. Aligning with Philip V of Macedon, he orchestrated a two-front strategy that stretched Ptolemaic defenses. The decisive victory at the Battle of Panium in 200 BCE delivered Coele Syria into Seleucid hands, ending nearly 8 decades of Ptolemaic dominance in the region. Archaeological remains near Banias, ancient Panium, and contemporary inscriptions celebrating Antiochus as the Great King confirm the campaign's political and ideological significance. For the first time since the founding of the dynasty, the Seleucids controlled a continuous realm from the Aegean to the borders of India. The wars were not purely destructive. They also stimulated state development. The need to fund prolonged campaigns led both dynasties to refine taxation, expand bureaucracies, and mint standardized currency. Shipyards at Seleucia, Pieria, and Alexandria advanced naval engineering, producing larger and more sophisticated warships. Innovations in siege technology, catapults, torsion engines, and defensive towers proliferated across the Hellenistic world. In this sense, the Syrian wars functioned as laboratories of imperial modernization, driving technical progress through relentless competition. Diplomacy mirrored warfare. Envoys and marriage alliances became extensions of the battlefield. The marriage of Antiochus III's daughter Cleopatra I to Ptolemy V in 194 BC formally ended the Fifth Syrian War and initiated a rare period of peace. Yet even this peace was political theater, a gesture of coexistence between exhausted powers. The young Ptolemy was a child. Cleopatra served as Seleucid influence within the Egyptian court. For a generation, this alliance stabilized relations but did not erase the underlying rivalry. By the time of the Sixth Syrian War, 170 to 168 BCE, the geopolitical landscape had shifted. Rome had entered the eastern Mediterranean as an arbiter of power, and the once dominant Hellenistic kings now navigated diplomacy under Roman observation. Antiochus IV Epiphanes invaded Egypt in 170 BCE, briefly occupying Alexandria before Roman intervention compelled his withdrawal. The famed Day of Eleusis, when the Roman envoy Popilius Laenas drew a circle in the sand demanding Antiochus' immediate retreat, symbolized the end of Seleucid independence in foreign affairs. The century-long struggle between Seleucids and Ptolemies thus concluded without decisive triumph. Both dynasties survived, but diminished. The wars had drained their treasuries, eroded manpower, and exposed the limits of Hellenistic imperial ambition. Yet they also left a durable legacy. The institutionalization of diplomacy, the expansion of bureaucratic administration, and the diffusion of Greek urban culture throughout the Levant. In the shadow of Alexander's ghost, the Seleucids and Ptolemies built the frameworks of statecraft that would later inform Roman governance in the East. Their rivalry transformed the ancient Near East from a battlefield of conquest into an arena of negotiated power. As Western rivals consumed attention, a reformer would rise to restore Seleucid greatness. From Antioch to Bactria, one king sought to bind the empire once more. When Antiochus III ascended the Seleucid throne in 223 BCE, the empire was fractured, its authority undermined by decades of rebellion and external defeat. The losses in Asia Minor and the growing autonomy of eastern satraps had reduced royal control to a patchwork of loosely loyal governors. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, described the early years of Antiochus' reign as a time of crisis when the empire's limbs had forgotten their head. It was against this backdrop of decline that Antiochus began the arduous task of reconstruction. His objective was not expansion for its own sake, but the restoration of a functioning imperial system. Antiochus inherited an empire whose coherence depended on two fragile mechanisms: personal allegiance and military garrisoning. The earlier wars with Egypt had drained resources, and local dynasts from Bactria to Asia Minor operated almost independently. Antiochus' first years were spent extinguishing internal threats. The usurpation attempt by Molon, the satrap of Media, in 222 BCE exemplified this crisis. Contemporary Babylonian cuneiform records from Uruk mention the revolt in the lands of the upper provinces, reflecting how deeply instability penetrated the imperial fabric. Antiochus personally led the campaign eastward, defeating Molon and reasserting the primacy of the royal court. This suppression of rebellion served as both a practical and symbolic act. The re-establishment of royal command redefined the monarchy not as a distant power but as a mobile center of authority. Antiochus' subsequent inspection tours across the empire, documented by Polybius and confirmed by scattered inscriptions, became a defining feature of his reign. These royal progresses combined administration, diplomacy, and spectacle. In each province, the king received petitions, adjusted taxes, and confirmed local offices. The practice recalled both Achaemenid precedent and Alexander's campaigns, blending Persian administrative continuity with Hellenistic performative kingship. Between 212 and 205 BCE, Antiochus undertook what Polybius termed the anabasis, a journey across the eastern satrapies that extended Seleucid authority to its farthest limits. Starting from Antioch, he advanced through Babylonia, Media, and Parthia before reaching the frontier of Bactria. Greek inscriptions at Susa and Babylon commemorate royal decrees issued during this expedition, including tax remissions and temple endowments. Archaeological findings at Ai Khanum in modern Afghanistan, Greek coins bearing Antiochus' portrait and bilingual dedications, testify to renewed central engagement in the eastern domains. The anabasis was more than a military campaign, it was a rearticulation of empire. By physically traversing his dominions, Antiochus asserted control through presence. His movement symbolized order restored from center to periphery. At Ecbatana and Persepolis, royal proclamations reinstated garrisons loyal to the crown, standardizing command structures that had lapsed into local control. Polybius notes that satraps were instructed to maintain fixed quotas of troops and tribute, supervised by inspectors directly accountable to the king. This policy strengthened vertical hierarchy and curtailed regional autonomy, transforming the empire's loosely federated model into a more bureaucratically coherent system. Three interpretive insights emerge from this phase of reform. First, Antiochus' policies reveal a deliberate synthesis of Hellenistic and Achaemenid governance. By adopting Persian territorial divisions yet filling offices with Greek-speaking administrators, he fused cultural legitimacy with administrative efficiency. Second, his emphasis on itinerant kingship revived the charisma of conquest without dismantling provincial institutions, a balance that earlier Seleucid rulers had failed to achieve. Third, the anabasis re-established the East not as a periphery, but as a pillar of the empire's identity, reaffirming the Seleucid claim to rule Asia in the tradition of Alexander. Antiochus also turned to economic and religious reconstruction. Standardizing coinage became a priority. Tetradrachms minted at Seleucia on the Tigris and Ecbatana display consistent imagery of the king wearing a diadem and Apollo seated on an omphalos, a deliberate emblem of divine sanction and economic unity. Inscriptions from Sardis and Babylon suggest that local mints were required to adopt these designs, linking regional economies to the royal image. Similarly, temple restorations served dual purposes: piety and propaganda. Antiochus sponsored repairs at major sanctuaries such as the Sagila in Babylon and the Temple of Anahita at Ecbatana, reaffirming continuity with both Greek and Iranian traditions. Records indicate that this religious patronage was accompanied by administrative oversight. Priestly hierarchies were reorganized to align with royal interests, and temple estates were integrated into the tax system. Archaeologists have uncovered dedicatory inscriptions naming Antiochus as the benefactor, Euergetes, a title that echoed both Greek civic ideals and Near Eastern royal benevolence. Through these acts, Antiochus positioned himself not merely as a conqueror but as a restorer of divine and civic order. The logistical dimension of Antiochus' reforms also reflected sophistication. Roads across northern Mesopotamia were resurfaced, fortresses along the Tigris modernized, and communication routes between Sardis, Antioch, and Susa improved. Administrative tablets from Babylon mention increased shipments of grain and silver between these centers, suggesting an expanding internal market. The revival of long-distance trade, especially via the Royal Road, reconnected the empire's economic arteries. The eastern provinces once again became the source of horses, textiles, and precious metals that sustained the Mediterranean core. Diplomatically, Antiochus leveraged his renewed strength to reassert Seleucid influence in Asia Minor and the Levant. He reclaimed territories lost to Pergamon and established alliances with local dynasts. The historian John Ma has emphasized how Antiochus' court functioned as a hub of interstate diplomacy, receiving embassies from Bactria, Cappadocia, and even distant India. This cosmopolitan diplomacy reflected the restored prestige of the Seleucid monarchy as the arbiter of the Eastern Hellenistic world. By 205 BCE, Antiochus III had achieved what no Seleucid ruler since Seleucus I had managed: a functioning, united empire. The Anabasis had reaffirmed both administrative control and ideological coherence. Antiochus had reconnected the empire's eastern wealth with its western institutions, transforming the throne at Antioch into a credible symbol of unity. His campaigns were celebrated in Greek poetry and recorded in Babylonian chronicles, where scribes referred to him as Antiochus, king of the world. Yet this restoration carried within it the seeds of future overreach. Antiochus' successes in the east emboldened him to turn westward, seeking to reclaim the former holdings of Alexander and to challenge rival powers in Asia Minor and beyond. Polybius' account closes this phase with a telling remark: "Having ordered the east, the king's heart was lifted toward the sea." The empire that Antiochus had rebuilt through administrative precision and diplomatic acumen would soon confront a new adversary: a disciplined, expansionist republic rising from the western Mediterranean. Eastward again marched the heirs of Alexander, but the world had changed. By 210 BCE, Antiochus III had restored stability to the Seleucid heartlands. Yet his ambitions stretched beyond mere consolidation. The king sought to revive the imperial reach of Seleucus I and, by extension, Alexander himself. The eastern provinces, Parthia, Hyrcania, and Bactria, had long since drifted toward independence. Their satraps, now semi-sovereign, controlled lucrative trade corridors and commanded armies loyal only in name to Antioch. Antiochus Anabasis, his great eastern expedition of 210 to 205 BCE, was thus both a campaign of reconquest and an ideological pilgrimage. It would reaffirm the Seleucid claim to rule the breadth of Asia. The campaign's earliest stages focused on the Iranian plateau. Antiochus advanced through Media and Parthia, reasserting royal control over territories lost since the reign of Seleucus II. Polybius' histories describe a series of methodical sieges rather than sweeping battles. The king's forces, composed of Macedonian phalangites, eastern cavalry, and war elephants, advanced along the royal road, restoring garrisons and demanding submission from local rulers. Archaeological evidence from Hyrcania and Nisa, including coin hoards minted in Antiochus' name, indicates the temporary restoration of Seleucid administration. The reoccupation of Parthia was symbolically vital. Situated on the margins of the Iranian plateau, it had once been a linchpin of Achaemenid communication networks. Antiochus' recovery of this region demonstrated continuity with the Persian imperial model, where control of the plateau equated to control of Asia itself. Inscriptions at Susa and Babylon commemorate these victories, referring to Antiochus, Great King, who restored the ancient dominion. The use of the epithet Great King, drawn from Achaemenid titulature, reveals how Antiochus consciously linked his conquests to the older traditions of Persian kingship while maintaining Hellenistic form. Continuing eastward, the campaign reached Bactria, the remote, wealthy satrapy centered on the Oxus River. There, Antiochus confronted Euthydemus I, the Greek ruler who had established an independent Bactrian kingdom. Polybius recounts that negotiations followed a prolonged but indecisive siege of Bactra. The eventual peace, sealed by dynastic marriage, recognized Euthydemus as a legitimate king while confirming Seleucid suzerainty in name. Though the outcome fell short of outright conquest, it represented a diplomatic success. Antiochus transformed a rebellious province into an allied Hellenistic state. Archaeological findings at Ai Khanum, a major Greek city on the Oxus, illuminate the effects of this reconciliation. Inscriptions dedicated to both Euthydemus and Antiochus suggest a dual political identity, local autonomy under the umbrella of Seleucid legitimacy. Greek civic institutions flourished alongside Eastern economic networks, demonstrating how political flexibility could achieve what extended warfare could not. Antiochus' Eastern policy thus exemplified selective integration rather than blanket domination, ensuring that the flow of tribute, goods, and soldiers continued westward without prolonged occupation. Three interpretive insights define this stage of Antiochus' expansion. First, the Eastern expedition reflected a reimagined imperialism grounded in pragmatism. Unlike Alexander's conquest for glory, Antiochus' campaigns sought administrative continuity and economic revival. Second, the king's diplomacy with Euthydemus illustrates an adaptive model of sovereignty, recognizing that peripheral Hellenistic states could coexist within a Seleucid-led hierarchy. Third, by adopting Persian royal symbolism alongside Greek cultural norms, Antiochus positioned the Seleucid monarchy as the true inheritor of both traditions, bridging the Mediterranean and the Iranian worlds. Beyond Bactria lay India, the mythic terminus of Alexander's march. Antiochus advanced to the Kabul Valley, where he met the Indian ruler Sophigasinus, known through Polybius accounts and later Greco-Roman sources. The two monarchs concluded a treaty of exchange. Antiochus received elephants and tribute in return for confirming boundaries along the Indus. The presence of Indian elephants in later Seleucid armies, including those deployed at the Battle of Magnesia decades later, demonstrates the enduring military consequences of this encounter. The diplomatic mission also revived commercial links between the Mediterranean and the Indian subcontinent, with the Indus frontier becoming a corridor of exchange in textiles, spices, and precious stones. Numismatic evidence reinforces this trans-regional connection. Coins minted in Bactria during and after Antiochus' campaign depict Zeus enthroned beside elephants, symbols of divine kingship and eastern reach. These coins circulated from the Oxus to Mesopotamia, embodying the fusion of Greek iconography and Indian symbolism. They functioned not only as currency but as propaganda, proclaiming that the Seleucid Empire had re-established contact with the furthest lands once traversed by Alexander. However, the Eastern expedition also revealed the limits of Seleucid power. The campaign's logistical demands were immense. Supplying armies across deserts and mountain passes required a level of organization that strained royal finances. Polybius notes that Antiochus was compelled to rely on local provisioning and temporary levies, suggesting that imperial infrastructure, though impressive, remained fragile over such vast distances. Moreover, while his victories restored prestige, they brought no lasting control over the farthest provinces. Within decades, both Parthia and Bactria would assert independence, proving that the eastern frontier could be pacified but not permanently subdued. Archaeological traces from this period illustrate both vitality and overextension. At Ai Khanum, monumental construction continued briefly after Antiochus' visit before ceasing abruptly, while coin output in eastern mints declined. These signs point to renewed prosperity followed by rapid contraction once central authority withdrew. The expedition had momentarily revived the East's economic arteries but could not sustain them without direct administrative presence. Nevertheless, the campaign's symbolic impact endured. In the eyes of contemporaries, Antiochus III had matched Alexander's geographic achievements, restoring Seleucid prestige across Asia. Greek chroniclers celebrated him as Antiochus the Great, a title that captured both his ambition and his temporary success. His journey from Antioch to the Indus reasserted the empire's cosmopolitan vision, an empire not confined by ethnicity or geography, but defined by the capacity to bridge worlds. By 205 BCE, Antiochus returned westward, his treasury replenished by tribute and his reputation renewed. Yet the same confidence that sustained the expedition now encouraged further ambition. Having re-established the East, Antiochus turned his gaze toward the Mediterranean, where declining Ptolemaic power and the rise of Rome offered both opportunity and peril. The Eastern campaign had shown the empire's resilience. The coming years would test its limits against new forces altogether. In Greece, the dream of empire met the reality of Rome. By the early 2nd century BCE, Antiochus III stood at the height of his power. His eastern campaigns had reasserted Seleucid prestige from the Aegean to the Indus, and his dominion stretched across the largest continuous territory in the Hellenistic world. Yet the geopolitical landscape had shifted. In the West, a new power had risen from Italy, disciplined, expansionist, and pragmatic. Rome's victory over Carthage had freed its armies to intervene in the fractured politics of the eastern Mediterranean. The confrontation between Antiochus and the Republic would mark the beginning of the Seleucid Empire's long descent. The origins of conflict lay in Greece. The region, once the cultural core of Hellenism, had become a patchwork of leagues and protectorates contested by Macedon, Pergamon, and the Anatolian League. Antiochus' decision to intervene there in 192 BCE was both ideological and strategic. He presented himself as the liberator of the Greeks from Roman interference, a claim consciously modeled on Alexander's earlier Pan-Hellenic rhetoric. Polybius records that Antiochus crossed into Greece with a modest but confident force, some 10,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and a handful of war elephants, believing local support would transform his campaign into a national uprising. The expected welcome did not materialize. Many Greek cities, weary of decades of war, preferred Rome's distant supervision to another Eastern monarch's patronage. Only the Anatolian League allied openly with Antiochus, and even then, local enthusiasm proved limited. The campaign began with initial successes at Chalcis and Thermopylae but quickly unraveled under Roman counterattack. At the Battle of Thermopylae in 191 BCE, Antiochus' forces were routed by the Roman consul Manius Acilius Glabrio, whose legions demonstrated the tactical adaptability that defined Rome's rise. Antiochus retreated across the Aegean, his hopes of a Greek alliance in ruins. Rome, now determined to eliminate Seleucid influence from Asia Minor, pursued the war across the sea. In 190 BCE, the decisive encounter occurred near Magnesia ad Sipylum. Polybius and Livy provide detailed accounts of this battle, one of the largest Hellenistic engagements ever fought. Antiochus commanded perhaps 70,000 men, including heavy phalanxes, cataphracts, and his famed Indian elephants. Facing him was the Roman army under Lucius Cornelius Scipio, brother of Scipio Africanus, supported by the Pergamene king Eumenes II. The outcome reflected a fundamental transformation in ancient warfare. The Roman manipular system, flexible and compartmentalized, outmaneuvered the dense Seleucid phalanx. At Magnesia, Antiochus personally led a cavalry charge that initially broke the Roman left, but his premature pursuit left the phalanx exposed. When Roman and Pergamene cavalry attacked from the flanks, the Seleucid center collapsed. Polybius remarks that the elephants, once the emblem of Seleucid might, caused chaos among their own ranks when wounded. The defeat was total. More than 50,000 Seleucid soldiers were killed or captured, and the empire's western frontier was irrevocably lost. In 188 BCE, the Treaty of Apamea formalized Seleucid submission. Its terms were punitive. Antiochus was forced to cede all territory west of the Taurus Mountains to Rome's allies, chiefly Pergamon and Rhodes. The royal fleet was limited to 12 ships, war elephants were forbidden, and a colossal indemnity of 15,000 talents was imposed, payable over 12 years. Hostages, including Antiochus' son, the future Antiochus IV, were taken to Rome as guarantees. Polybius' account of the treaty underscores the symbolic nature of these restrictions. It was not merely a peace but an assertion of Roman hegemony over the Hellenistic order. 3 analytical observations define the significance of Magnesia and Apamea. First, the war revealed the structural limits of the Seleucid system. Antiochus' army, though large, relied on traditional formations and a patchwork of regional contingents. Rome's professionalized legions, by contrast, embodied a new military economy, standardized, disciplined, and strategically coordinated. Second, the conflict demonstrated the end of the Hellenistic balance of power. For nearly a century, the Seleucid, Ptolemaic, and Antigonid dynasties had maintained a precarious equilibrium. Now, Rome stood as the external arbiter of their disputes. Third, the indemnities and territorial losses inflicted at Apamea destabilized Seleucid finances, forcing the monarchy into dependence on eastern revenues and temple treasuries. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence from Anatolia confirms the transformation that followed. Inscriptions from Sardis and Pergamon celebrate the liberation of Asia from Seleucid rule, while Seleucid coinage contracted sharply after 188 BCE. At Dur-Europos and Babylon, contemporary records document new tax levies and confiscations intended to meet Roman demands. Economically, the empire's western provinces, its most urbanized and commercially integrated, were gone. The royal treasury, once filled with revenues from Asia Minor, now relied heavily on Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. The humiliation of Apamea also reshaped the Seleucid court's ideological posture. Antiochus III, though undefeated in the east, became a diminished figure in the west. Polybius notes his subsequent attempts to strengthen central authority through domestic reforms and renewed attention to provincial governance. Yet the psychological blow was profound. The image of the Seleucid monarch as the universal ruler of Asia, heir to both Alexander and Darius, had been shattered by the legions of a distant republic. The king's death in 187 BCE during a campaign in Elymais, reportedly while attempting to plunder a temple to finance indemnity payments, symbolized the exhaustion of the empire. His successors inherited a state financially strained and politically constrained. Antiochus' son Seleucus IV managed to maintain stability through cautious diplomacy but could not restore the lost prestige. The loss of the western provinces marked a strategic contraction. The Seleucid realm turned inward, increasingly reliant on its eastern satrapies and urban centers like Seleucia and Antioch. Interpretively, the confrontation between Antiochus and Rome encapsulates a pivotal shift in Mediterranean history. The Hellenistic kingdoms, for all their cultural sophistication, operated within a model of monarchic charisma and local autonomy ill-suited to the rising mechanisms of Roman statecraft. The Republic's combination of disciplined military organization, economic extraction, and flexible diplomacy allowed it to project power without direct colonization, at least initially. For the Seleucids, adaptation meant survival, resistance meant ruin. Despite defeat, traces of resilience remained. The Seleucid administration continued to function efficiently in Mesopotamia and Syria. Greek civic institutions endured, and coinage reforms under later kings stabilized local economies. Rome, content with its new hegemony, did not immediately annex Seleucid lands, but instead transformed the empire into a compliant buffer against Parthia and Egypt. In this sense, the Seleucid state entered a new phase, not of dominance, but of negotiated endurance within a Roman-centered world. Numismatic continuity illustrates this subtle persistence. Coins minted in Antioch after Apamea replaced the image of divine kingship with that of civic stability, featuring Apollo and the anchor, the dynasty's emblem of continuity amid decline. These coins circulated widely, affirming that the empire, though reduced, still possessed coherence and identity. By mid-century, the Seleucids had become the eastern pillars of a Mediterranean system now defined by Roman oversight. Their survival depended on cultural adaptation rather than territorial expansion. The great battles of the past had given way to diplomacy, internal administration, and the slow transformation of Hellenism under imperial constraints. The encounter at Magnesia thus stands not only as a military defeat but as a civilizational threshold. It marked the end of the Hellenistic world as a self-determining system and the emergence of Rome as the arbiter of its destiny. For the Seleucid Empire, the age of conquest was over. The age of endurance had begun. In marble and mortar, the empire reinvented itself. After the humiliation of Apamea, the Seleucid Empire no longer measured its greatness in miles conquered but in cities sustained. The wide dominion of Antiochus III had contracted, yet what remained was far from ruin. In Syria and Mesopotamia, a refined urban civilization took root, an empire of streets, aqueducts, and civic institutions that carried forward the Hellenistic ideal under altered conditions. The Seleucid state of the 2nd century BCE was less a machine of conquest than an intricate lattice of urban centers whose endurance defined its later strength. Antioch, the radiant capital on the Orontes, became the empire's beating heart. Founded generations earlier by Seleucus I, the city now matured into one of the ancient world's premier metropolises. Archaeological excavations reveal layered infrastructure. Colonnaded avenues aligned with precision, terraced aqueducts feeding elaborate bath complexes, and a system of underground drains unparalleled outside Rome itself. Its theaters and gymnasia were spaces not merely of leisure but of identity, sustaining a civic rhythm that transcended political change. Mosaic floors from the city's villas, depicting scenes from Homer and local myth alike, testify to a sophisticated urban elite blending Greek aesthetic sensibilities with Syrian craftsmanship. Seleucia on the Tigris, the empire's eastern twin, embodied a similar synthesis. Established as the administrative successor to Babylon, Seleucia maintained its importance through a complex balance of local autonomy and royal oversight. Clay tablets and Greek inscriptions found near the city's precincts describe magistrates bearing both Greek and Aramaic titles, strategoi alongside pahetis, illustrating how the Seleucid bureaucracy functioned bilingually. The Seleucid kings understood that effective governance required more than imposition. It demanded translation, adaptation, and shared ritual. Local assemblies handled taxation and infrastructure, while royal commissioners supervised trade along the Tigris. Urban life in the post-Apamea period was not static. Each city functioned as a node in an imperial network of administration, communication, and culture. Roads radiated outward from Antioch and Seleucia, linking provincial centers such as Sardis, Apamea, and Edessa. These routes carried soldiers, officials, and merchants, but also ideas. Stoic philosophy, Babylonian astronomy, and local cult traditions intermingled in the agora. The Seleucid Empire had become a federation of cities, each bearing the imprint of a shared Hellenistic template, but localized through geography and tradition. Sardis, the jewel of Western Anatolia, offers a vivid case study in adaptation. Once the capital of the Lydian kings and later an Achaemenid satrapal seat, Sardis flourished again under Seleucid patronage. Excavations reveal newly constructed stoas, gymnasia, and a reconfigured acropolis incorporating both Greek and Persian architectural features. The reuse of older foundations symbolized a deliberate continuity. The Seleucids did not erase the past but built upon it. Inscriptions honoring Antiochus III and his successors record civic decrees issued by the council and the people, echoing democratic formulas while affirming loyalty to the monarch. This balance between autonomy and allegiance characterized the Seleucid urban order. Central to this stability was a pragmatic administrative design. In place of massive military garrisons, cities maintained clericies, Settlements of veteran soldiers granted land in exchange for readiness to serve. These men acted as both farmers and defenders, grounding imperial authority in local prosperity. Taxation, once extracted by satrapal decree, now flowed through civic treasuries. Surviving papyri and inscriptions suggest a tiered system. Municipal taxes funded local amenities, while surplus revenues were remitted to the royal fisc. This decentralization reduced bureaucratic strain while strengthening civic pride. Yet this urban renaissance was built atop fiscal discipline born of necessity. The indemnities owed to Rome had stripped the monarchy of liquidity, forcing efficiency upon an administration long accustomed to abundance. Antiochus III and his successors responded by formalizing civic record-keeping, standardizing coinage weights, and encouraging temple endowments that doubled as local banks. Bronze and silver coins from this era display consistent iconography. The royal anchor, Apollo seated with bow in hand, signaling monetary coherence across a territorially fragmented state. Economic unity, rather than territorial vastness, became the empire's organizing principle. Religion, too, played an administrative role. Civic cults honoring both local deities and the Seleucid kings acted as instruments of cohesion. Antioch, for instance, celebrated the Antiochian Games, blending Greek athleticism with Syrian ceremonial processions. At Seleucia, temples to Apollo and Nabu stood side by side, their priests cooperating in festivals funded jointly by Greek guilds and Babylonian households. Such syncretic worship reinforced the image of the king as a mediator between cultures. Even as Rome dictated foreign policy, the Seleucids retained ideological sovereignty through the language of divine patronage. Architecturally, the Seleucid cities of this later period reveal an evolving aesthetic. Stone replaced mud brick, colonnades framed civic squares, and theaters were oriented to maximize both acoustics and visibility, fostering collective experience. Scholars note that Antioch's urban grid, unlike earlier Macedonian settlements, incorporated natural contours and pre-existing roads, a reflection of local adaptation rather than imposed geometry. The empire's engineers mastered compromise as art. Despite outward prosperity, cracks underlay this urban order. Population growth strained water supplies, earthquakes repeatedly damaged Antioch and Laodicea, and rural hinterlands often suffered under the weight of taxation. The balance between civic autonomy and royal authority required constant negotiation. Inscriptions from Asia Minor and Syria reveal petitions from city councils appealing for tax remissions or relief from garrison expenses. The Seleucid kings, constrained by debt and politics, alternated between benevolence and coercion. Civic loyalty remained high, but it was loyalty born of mutual dependence rather than devotion. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire's greatest legacy was no longer its military might, but its administrative sophistication. Through its cities, it had created a durable framework for urban governance that would outlast the dynasty itself. When the Romans and later the Parthians absorbed these territories, they inherited not a wilderness but a functioning civic infrastructure. Streets, councils, archives, and rituals that continued to shape life for centuries. The Seleucid achievement was thus one of continuity amid constraint, an imperial identity sustained not by conquest but by civic resilience. Every coin bore a king's face and the empire's burden. The Seleucid Empire of the 2nd century BCE relied on a sophisticated, monetized economy to sustain its urban centers and administrative machinery. Coin hoards and papyrus tax records from Mesopotamia, Syria, and Asia Minor demonstrate that silver tetradrachms, standardized in weight and imagery, were the primary medium of exchange. These coins were not merely instruments of commerce. They were instruments of statecraft, signaling royal authority while facilitating market activity across a geographically diverse empire. The consistent iconography, Apollo seated on an omphalos, or the royal diademed portrait of the reigning king, broadcast both fiscal reliability and ideological presence. Trade networks were integral to economic cohesion. The Orontes Valley, Mesopotamian plains and Levantine ports functioned as arteries connecting agricultural production with urban markets. Archaeological excavations in Antioch, Seleucia, and Apamea reveal granaries, marketplaces, and storage complexes capable of regulating the flow of grain, olive oil, and textiles. Caravans from the interior supplied the Mediterranean cities, while riverine traffic along the Tigris and Euphrates ensured that eastern surplus reached Seleucia, the Tigris, and Antioch. Greek and Aramaic inscriptions indicate the presence of merchant guilds and civic warehouses, highlighting collaboration between local elites and the royal administration. Taxation remained central to imperial finance. Surviving cuneiform tablets and papyri describe structured levies on land, livestock, and trade. Farmers in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia contributed a portion of their crops to urban centers and royal coffers, while merchants paid duties in silver. The standardization of coinage facilitated collection and mitigated disputes over valuations, a particularly important function after the financial strain imposed by Rome's indemnities following the Treaty of Apamea, 188 BCE. The monetary system linked provincial economies to central authority, binding together an empire that was territorially reduced but administratively coherent. Economic integration also reinforced political legitimacy. By circulating coins bearing the king's image, Antiochus III and his successors maintained visibility across a fragmented empire. Numismatic evidence from Bactria, Babylonia, and western Syria reveals that even distant provinces adhered to standardized minting practices. Each tetradrachm affirmed a shared economic and cultural framework, reinforcing loyalty to the Seleucid throne. Inscriptions from Ai Khanum and Babylon explicitly celebrate the king's provision of coinage for temples and civic works, further entwining fiscal policy with public perception. Agricultural productivity underpinned this monetized economy. The Mesopotamian plains, irrigated by the Tigris and Euphrates, produced staple crops that supplied both urban populations and the royal treasury. The Orontes Valley contributed grain, olive oil, and wine to coastal and inland markets, while river transport minimized logistical bottlenecks. Evidence from pollen analysis and sediment cores confirms large-scale irrigation and soil management practices, demonstrating that the Seleucids actively shaped the landscape to sustain both fiscal and social stability. Yet the system had vulnerabilities. Rome's indemnities drained the treasury, forcing heavier taxation and periodic debasement of coinage. Numismatic studies reveal episodes of silver content reduction in tetradrachms during the late 2nd century BCE, suggesting inflationary pressures. These fiscal constraints limited investment in infrastructure and military provisioning, highlighting the tension between urban prosperity, royal expenditure, and international obligations. Despite this, the Seleucid administration maintained sufficient economic resilience to support civic institutions and regional trade. Three interpretive insights emerge from this economic framework. First, coinage functioned as both medium and message. It enabled commerce while projecting royal authority into every marketplace. Second, trade and agriculture were deeply integrated into urban planning and administrative oversight, demonstrating a systemic approach to sustaining empire. Third, fiscal strain under Roman oversight foreshadowed the long-term contraction of Seleucid power, revealing how economic dependency and geopolitical subordination could compromise imperial durability. The Seleucid economy exemplifies the empire's broader approach to governance, a combination of structured administration, cultural cohesion, and pragmatic resource management. While armies once enforced authority across the expanse of Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, it was the circulation of coinage, the productivity of farmland, and the regulation of trade that sustained imperial coherence in the post-Apamea period. Fiscal policy thus became a substitute for military projection, enabling the Seleucid state to survive even as territorial losses accumulated. By the late 2nd century BCE, the empire had achieved a delicate balance. Cities were supplied, taxes collected, and trade maintained, but the strain of Roman tribute, local unrest, and natural variability underscored the fragility of these achievements. Seleucid coins continued to circulate widely, a testament to the enduring symbolic and practical reach of the monarchy, even as the state's capacity for expansion had waned. Where languages met, gods multiplied. In the Seleucid Empire of the 2nd century BCE, culture and religion became instruments of cohesion as much as expression. With territorial contraction and fiscal pressure following the Treaty of Apamea, the monarchy relied increasingly on cultural diplomacy to sustain legitimacy. Greek traditions, philosophy, theater, and civic ritual coexisted alongside Mesopotamian, Persian, and local cults, producing a deliberate fusion that reflected the empire's heterogeneous composition. The Seleucid court actively promoted this synthesis, framing Hellenistic forms as compatible with regional beliefs rather than in opposition to them. Urban temples and sanctuaries illustrate this policy vividly. At Dura-Europos, archaeological excavations reveal shrines where Greek deities such as Zeus were represented alongside local Mesopotamian gods. Reliefs depict shared iconography. Zeus holding the thunderbolt may appear on the same frieze as Baal or Nabu, sometimes receiving offerings from worshippers in traditional Eastern dress. Similarly, at Hatra, inscriptions record dedications that invoke Seleucid kingship in parallel with local religious authority, demonstrating a negotiated legitimacy wherein divine favor was culturally plural rather than monolithic. The monarchy also encouraged Greek civic and cultural institutions, even in non-Greek urban centers. Gymnasia, theaters, and libraries were constructed in cities such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Apamea, providing venues for athletic competition, philosophical discourse, and public assemblies. Papyrus records and inscriptions indicate that local elites participated in these institutions, often holding magistracies or sponsoring public festivals. These practices reinforced loyalty to the monarchy by offering tangible benefits and shared civic identity without displacing existing local customs. Religious festivals functioned as political as well as spiritual instruments. Annual celebrations often integrated Greek ritual with native rites, fostering shared experience across ethnic and linguistic boundaries. For example, in Seleucia, the king's patronage of both Apollo and local Babylonian deities linked civic identity to royal authority. Polytheistic syncretism, sometimes formalized through dual epithets such as Zeusbel, symbolized the Seleucid claim to continuity with both Hellenistic and Persian traditions, projecting an image of an empire capable of encompassing multiple worlds. Three interpretive insights emerge from this period of cultural synthesis. First, the Seleucid state deliberately employed intercultural fusion as a mechanism of governance, recognizing that local loyalty could be secured through respect for pre-existing religious structures. Second, the juxtaposition of Greek and Eastern iconography functioned as both propaganda and social glue, maintaining cohesion in cities far from Antioch or Seleucia. Third, the integration of philosophy, theater, and religious ritual reflected a strategy of elite incorporation. By engaging local intelligentsia in public life, the monarchy anchored loyalty within both civic and spiritual spheres. Numismatic and epigraphic evidence reinforces this fusion. Coins issued during the late Seleucid period often feature royal portraits flanked by symbols of Eastern deities. Inscriptions from Mesopotamian cities describe temple endowments funded jointly by civic councils and the king, highlighting cooperation between local elites and the central administration. Such measures were not merely ceremonial. They stabilized revenue flows by associating taxation with sacred obligation, enhancing compliance without coercion. Cultural diplomacy extended beyond urban centers. Antiochus IV and his predecessors corresponded with distant cities, offering privileges to merchants and guilds in exchange for ritual dedications. Greek and local languages appear side by side on official inscriptions, reflecting an imperial policy of bilingualism designed to unify administrative practice and religious devotion. Archaeologists note that this linguistic duality facilitated communication across a linguistically fragmented empire, while simultaneously projecting Seleucid identity as both Hellenistic and cosmopolitan. Despite these successes, underlying tensions persisted. Provincial populations occasionally resisted cultural imposition, whether through revolt or passive noncompliance. In Babylon and Elamites, records indicate sporadic uprisings linked to religious grievances or taxation, suggesting that cultural cohesion could not fully substitute for effective governance or military presence. Nevertheless, the Seleucid emphasis on cultural synthesis mitigated widespread unrest, enabling the monarchy to maintain authority in an empire increasingly constrained by fiscal and external pressures. By the end of this period, Seleucid cities had evolved into centers of pluralistic civic life. Greek theater and philosophy flourished alongside Eastern temples. Royal and local cults coexisted in the same sacred precincts. Inscriptions, coins, and architecture alike broadcasted a deliberate message of unity amid diversity. The empire's survival in the West and resilience in the East owed as much to this cultural and religious strategy as to armies or treasury. Seleucid kings, constrained by Rome and internal challenges, relied on shared culture to project power, cultivating identity where military dominance could no longer suffice. A king's ambition reignited old gods and new wars. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire faced pressures both internal and external that challenged the durability of its Hellenistic system. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, ascending the throne in 175 BCE, pursued energetic centralization and vigorous Hellenization policies across the empire. He sought to reinforce royal authority, standardize administration, and cultivate Greek culture as a unifying framework. Yet these measures, ambitious in intent, inadvertently exposed fault lines between imperial aspirations and provincial realities. The most prominent of these fractures emerged in Judea. In 167 BCE, the Maccabean revolt erupted, catalyzed by Antiochus' enforcement of Greek cultic practices and restrictions on Jewish worship. Sources such as the books of Maccabees and Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews describe the suppression of traditional rites, installation of Hellenistic altars, and imposition of civic obligations at odds with local religious law. Archaeological evidence, including desecrated temple sites and inscriptions referencing Greek cultic activity, corroborates these textual accounts. The revolt revealed that efforts to impose uniform cultural policies could provoke systemic resistance, particularly in regions with strong religious identity. The Maccabean uprising was not merely a localized disturbance. It reflected broader tensions inherent in the Seleucid system. Antiochus' centralizing reforms often disrupted long-standing arrangements of local autonomy. In provinces from Coele to Babylonia, cities and satraps accustomed to managing taxation, temples, and civic law independently now face stricter oversight and expectations of compliance with royal edicts. Resistance, therefore, was as much a reaction to political intrusion as to cultural imposition. Greek sources, including Polybius, note that provincial dissatisfaction frequently coalesced around charismatic local leaders, emphasizing the interplay between governance and loyalty in the Seleucid polity. Dynastic discord compounded these challenges. Court factions and succession disputes undermined consistent policy enforcement. Antiochus IV, himself a product of earlier fraternal conflicts, contended with rival claimants, ambitious generals, and elite advisors whose allegiances were often opportunistic. Contemporary inscriptions from Antioch and Babylon mention appointments and dismissals of strategoi and satraps in rapid succession, reflecting the instability of central authority. The combination of local revolts and internal intrigue created an environment in which imperial cohesion relied on personal leadership more than systemic robustness. Military responses to revolts further illustrate the empire's structural vulnerabilities. Antiochus IV deployed phalanx infantry, cavalry, and mercenary contingents to suppress insurrections in Judea and coastal Anatolia. While initially effective, these operations stretched resources and necessitated repeated campaigns, exposing the limitations of a force designed for conventional territorial control rather than irregular resistance. The Maccabees' guerrilla tactics demonstrated that localized, culturally grounded opposition could exploit both terrain and popular support, delaying imperial response and complicating governance. Three interpretive insights illuminate this period. First, Antiochus IV's policies exemplify the tension between centralization and heterogeneity in large Hellenistic empires. Uniformity imposed from the center could generate opposition in culturally distinct provinces. Second, dynastic and courtly instability amplified the impact of regional revolts. indicating that systemic governance depended on personal authority and elite cohesion. Third, the Maccabean revolt illustrates how religious identity could serve as both a source of resistance and a lens through which imperial policy was interpreted, reinforcing the importance of cultural diplomacy alongside military might. Provincial unrest was not confined to Judea. In Anatolia and Mesopotamia, sporadic revolts arose from taxation disputes and local dissatisfaction with Greek administration. Inscriptions and civic decrees from cities like Sardis and Laodicea reference petitions for relief from imposed levies, revealing that economic and administrative pressures intersected with cultural tensions. Military suppression of these uprisings required careful balancing. Excessive force risked alienating urban elites, while leniency could encourage further defiance. This delicate calculus shaped the empire's approach to governance in the decades following Antiochus IV's death. The combination of rebellion and dynastic factionalism signaled a turning point in Seleucid durability. Antiochus IV's energetic centralization had temporarily strengthened royal authority, but at the cost of provoking systemic resistance. Provinces with entrenched local identities resisted standardization. Elite factions contested succession, and military resources were stretched thin. These dynamics revealed the underlying fragility of the empire. Cohesion depended less on institutional continuity than on the charisma and policy judgment of the reigning monarch. By 164 BCE, the Seleucid state had survived the Maccabean revolt but not without compromise. Judea gained de facto autonomy under Hasmonean leadership, illustrating that cultural and religious tolerance, or the lack thereof, had direct political consequences. Across the empire, other regions adapted to imperial expectations unevenly, creating a patchwork of compliance and resistance. The legacy of Antiochus IV's reign thus lies in both its demonstration of imperial ambition and its exposure of the structural vulnerabilities inherent in the Seleucid system. In the East, new kings minted their own destinies. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Seleucid authority over its eastern territories had effectively collapsed. The provinces of Parthia and Bactria, once integral to the empire's wealth and strategic depth, had slipped from the crown's grasp. Numismatic evidence provides a clear chronicle of this fragmentation. Coinage minted independently in Parthia under Arsaces I and in Bactria under Diodotus I demonstrates the assertion of sovereignty, adopting royal iconography distinct from Seleucid precedent. These new mints signaled political autonomy, the repudiation of tribute obligations, and the emergence of rival dynasties capable of controlling trade and resources formerly under Seleucid administration. Epigraphic records and Greek sources confirm that the empire's eastern retreat was gradual but inexorable. Inscriptions from Seleucia on the Tigris and Babylon in the late 2nd century BCE describe local satraps exercising autonomous authority, often negotiating with neighboring powers without reference to Antiochus IV or his successors. Archaeological evidence from Ai Khanum in Bactria and Nisa in Parthia shows continued Hellenistic urban development under local rulers, suggesting that while Seleucid cultural influence persisted, political control was irreversibly severed. The empire's capacity to project military power east of the Euphrates had diminished, constrained by logistical challenges, internal factionalism, and the necessity of defending Syria against Rome and rising Parthian forces. The loss of these eastern provinces had profound economic and strategic consequences. Mesopotamia had previously served as the empire's principal granary and tax base, while Bactria and Parthia contributed to trans-regional trade with India and Central Asia. With these regions independent, Seleucid coffers contracted dramatically, limiting expenditures on infrastructure, military garrisons, and civic patronage. Coinage from the remaining imperial mints increasingly reflects this economic strain. Silver content was reduced, circulation was geographically constrained, and royal imagery emphasized continuity and legitimacy rather than expansion. Strategically, the empire's eastern secessions exposed Syria to new pressures. The Seleucid heartland, previously buffered by the Euphrates frontier, now became the empire's de facto perimeter. Cities such as Antioch, Apamea, and Laodicea became the sole focus of military and administrative attention. While these urban centers retained civic and cultural vitality, The absence of eastern revenues forced selective allocation of troops and resources, reducing the empire's ability to respond to internal unrest or external aggression. Historians observe that the contraction of Eastern influence effectively transformed the Seleucid state from a transcontinental empire into a regional polity centered on Syria and northern Mesopotamia. The political implications extended to legitimacy and royal ideology. Antiochus IV and his successors continued to issue coinage depicting kings as heirs of Alexander and Darius, but these images now masked a more limited reality. The persistent circulation of Seleucid motifs in eastern cities, even after formal independence, reflects both the inertia of Hellenistic cultural influence and the symbolic contestation of authority. Local rulers appropriated Greek forms to legitimize themselves while rejecting Seleucid suzerainty. In this sense, numismatics and architecture become both historical evidence and interpretive tools for understanding the dynamics of fragmentation. Three interpretive insights emerge from this period of Eastern secession. First, geopolitical overreach, compounded by internal revolts and Roman-imposed constraints, made sustained control over distant provinces untenable. Second, economic dependency on Eastern revenues meant that territorial loss immediately constrained fiscal and military capacity. Third, the gradual nature of autonomy, through local mints, administrative independence, and cultural continuity, demonstrates that fragmentation was systemic rather than abrupt, resulting from structural weaknesses rather than single military defeats. By the late 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire had been reduced to a truncated state, its eastern wealth and strategic depth permanently lost. Parthia and Bactria, now independent polities, continued Hellenistic cultural practices even as they pursued separate dynastic agendas. The Seleucid focus shifted entirely to Syria, a region with urban cohesion but limited capacity to compensate for the lost economic base. In the east, Hellenistic influence endured, but Seleucid authority had ended. This contraction marked a decisive shift in the empire's trajectory. With its eastern provinces gone, the Seleucid state faced an era defined not by expansion but by maintenance, negotiation, and internal management. Territorial diminution was accompanied by fiscal strain, social tension, and the constant threat of further fragmentation, a pattern that would dominate the final century of Seleucid history. What bureaucracy built, inertia unmade. By the late 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire's sophisticated administrative apparatus was under severe strain. Decades of territorial contraction, military expenditure, and fiscal pressure had weakened central authority, leaving provincial governance increasingly autonomous. Succession crises, most notably following the deaths of Antiochus IV 164 BCE, and later Antiochus V and Demetrius I, disrupted continuity at the highest levels. With monarchs often young, absent, or contested, satraps and city councils filled the resulting void, asserting independence in taxation, civic decision-making, and military provisioning. Documentary papyri from Babylon provide a detailed glimpse into this erosion of royal oversight. Records show that governors, once accountable to royal commissioners, began issuing orders, collecting tribute, and adjudicating local disputes without reference to Antioch or Seleucia on the Tigris. Correspondence between civic councils and the central administration, previously routine, declined sharply. In some cases, city archives reveal that governors appropriated resources to maintain garrisons or fund local projects, effectively creating de facto mini-states within the empire. Archaeological layers in cities such as Seleucia, Dur-Europos, and Apamea suggest independent urban initiatives continued even as central coordination weakened. The reliance on mercenary forces further exemplifies administrative fatigue. With depleted revenues and a shrinking recruitment base among Greek settlers and Macedonian colonists, the monarchy increasingly depended on paid soldiers drawn from Anatolia, Thrace, and beyond. While effective in short-term defense, this reliance undermined discipline and loyalty. Mercenary units often acted in their own interest, demanding higher pay or withholding service in response to political uncertainty. Inscriptions and military contracts indicate escalating costs and contractual complexity, reflecting a system compensating for declining institutional cohesion. Provincial autonomy had practical as well as ideological consequences. Tax collection, judicial enforcement, and infrastructure maintenance became uneven. The Orontes and Euphrates irrigation networks, crucial to agricultural productivity, suffered from inconsistent management. City councils issued petitions for royal intervention that were delayed or ignored, illustrating the limits of central enforcement. Economically vital regions like Syria retained production capacity, but coordination across the broader imperial network, the hallmark of Seleucid administration, was unraveling. 3 interpretive insights clarify the significance of administrative fatigue. First, the empire's once effective integration of Greek and Eastern bureaucratic models relied on continuous royal presence and oversight. In their absence, systemic cohesion degraded. Second, autonomy among satraps and cities, while adaptive in the short term, accelerated political fragmentation as local interests increasingly diverged from central priorities. Third, reliance on mercenaries highlights the interaction between fiscal strain and military effectiveness. Diminished revenue forced compromises that ultimately weakened state control. The collapse of central authority manifested not only in governance but in symbolic expressions of legitimacy. Coinage and inscriptions from this period display uneven imagery, with local rulers or satraps issuing money bearing modified royal portraits or civic symbols. This decentralization of visual authority paralleled the bureaucratic erosion, signaling to subjects that the king's influence was waning. Cultural and religious institutions, previously instruments of integration, remained important but could no longer substitute for functional administration. Ultimately, the Seleucid system, long admired for its ability to integrate diverse territories and populations, succumbed to inertia. Provinces operated independently, military cohesion eroded, and fiscal networks faltered. The empire persisted nominally, but effective governance had fragmented. The decline was gradual, systemic, and internally generated rather than imposed solely by external enemies. This phase of administrative fatigue set the stage for further territorial losses, opportunistic incursions, and the rise of new regional powers in the Near East. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire's once pristine bureaucracy had become a patchwork of autonomous provinces, mercenary enclaves, and self-regulating cities. What had been a model of integration, the careful balance of Greek administrative principles, local elites, and royal oversight, now dissolved into regionalism. Imperial authority survived only in name, while practical control rested with local actors responding to immediate needs rather than overarching policy. From the steppes rode the new masters of the East. By the early 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire faced a formidable new power on its eastern frontier. The Parthians, under Mithridates I 171 to 132 BCE, capitalized on Seleucid weakness to seize control of Media, Babylonia, and strategic territories along the Euphrates. Contemporary clay tablets from Uruk document the administrative transition, noting the transfer of land oversight, reorganization of taxation, and appointment of Ars Acid officials. These records indicate a deliberate, systematic replacement of Seleucid structures with Parthian governance while maintaining continuity in economic and civic operations. Archaeological excavations across Babylonia and Media corroborate textual evidence. Fortifications, administrative buildings, and inscriptions reflect a blend of Hellenistic urban planning and emerging Parthian administrative norms. While Greek cultural forms, such as coinage, iconography, and urban layout, persisted, the political authority now rested with Ars Acid rulers, who introduced tribal and militarized governance alongside inherited bureaucratic mechanisms. Numismatic evidence shows coins minted in Seleucia the Tigris and Ctesiphon bearing the image of Mithridates I, signaling both legitimacy and practical control over trade and tribute networks previously dominated by the Seleucids. Seleucid responses to this eastern challenge were intermittent and largely reactive. Demetrius II undertook campaigns to reclaim lost territories, temporarily recapturing Babylonian cities, but logistical difficulties, internal revolt, and lack of sustained support prevented durable success. Antiochus VII Sidite's later campaigns achieved more tangible gains. as he briefly reconquered Mesopotamia and pursued punitive operations against Parthian forces. Sources such as Josephus and Polybius describe the campaign in precise terms. Antiochus II's coordination of Greek phalanx infantry, cavalry units, and mercenary contingents initially restored imperial presence, but the return of Parthian forces and the death of the Seleucid king in battle at Ecbatana, 129 BCE, confirmed the permanence of Eastern loss. Parthia's rise represents a structural shift in imperial dynamics. Whereas the Seleucid Empire had once projected authority from Syria through Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau, the ascendant Arsacids reversed this trajectory. The empire's economic and strategic heart now lay under Parthian control, redirecting trade along the Euphrates and overland routes towards Central Asia. Greek inscriptions and Hellenistic urban remnants indicate that Seleucid cultural influence persisted even as political authority waned, highlighting the complex continuity between Hellenistic and Parthian governance. Several interpretive observations clarify the significance of this transition. First, Parthian consolidation demonstrates that imperial decline is often gradual. Seleucid authority eroded incrementally through military setbacks, fiscal strain, and administrative fatigue, rather than a single catastrophic event. Second, the retention of Hellenistic administrative and urban forms under Arsacid rule illustrates a pragmatic adoption of existing systems to legitimize new authority, emphasizing continuity amid political change. Third, the shift of geopolitical gravity eastward underscores the growing peripheralization of the Seleucid state, whose remaining territories were increasingly confined to Syria and the Levant, reliant on Roman diplomacy and local compliance for survival. The rise of Parthia also had economic consequences for the Seleucids. Babylonia and Media had been among the wealthiest provinces, contributing substantial agricultural surplus, trade revenue, and tribute. Their permanent loss deprived the Seleucid monarchy of critical fiscal resources, weakening the capacity to maintain garrisons, support urban infrastructure, or finance campaigns against Rome and other regional powers. Numismatic evidence demonstrates reduced silver content and circulation in Western mints, reflecting constrained resources. The empire's focus shifted to maximizing revenue from Syria, Phoenicia, and the coastal Levantine corridor, a defensive posture dictated by necessity rather than choice. Culturally, Parthia's ascendancy created a layered Hellenistic landscape. Greek-speaking urban populations, temple institutions, and civic councils remained operational under Arsacid oversight, while the administrative elite gradually incorporated local tribal structures. This hybrid system facilitated taxation, law enforcement, and military conscription, illustrating that Hellenistic forms could survive politically subordinate to emergent regional powers. The result was an enduring fusion. Greek cities and Mesopotamian settlements functioned under the political framework of the Parthian monarchy, a phenomenon visible in inscriptions, coinage, and archaeological continuity. By the close of Antiochus II's campaigns and the death of the king in 129 BCE, the Seleucid Empire had lost permanent control over its eastern provinces. Parthia's expansion marked an irreversible eastward shift in regional power, redefining the balance in the Near East. The Seleucid state, now territorially constrained and financially weakened, could no longer exert influence over the Iranian plateau or Mesopotamia. While culturally Hellenistic enclaves persisted, the political landscape had been transformed. New centers of power emerged, borders contracted, and the empire's strategic options were dramatically curtailed. This episode illustrates the interaction of military, administrative, and economic factors in the decline of imperial authority. External pressure from an ascendant Parthia exploited internal weaknesses, administrative fatigue, depleted treasury, and succession crises, demonstrating how systemic vulnerabilities can be amplified by emergent regional actors. The Seleucid Empire endured nominally, but its role in Eastern affairs was effectively ended. In the empire's ruins, successors still spoke Greek. The contraction of Seleucid authority in the east and the decline of centralized power created space for regional polities to assert independence. Commagene, Cappadocia, and Armenia emerged as autonomous or semi-autonomous kingdoms, often serving as buffers between the remaining Seleucid state and Parthian expansion. These local dynasties preserved aspects of Hellenistic administration, urbanism, and culture, demonstrating that Greek influence could outlive political hegemony. Monumental inscriptions, coins, and architectural remains attest to the durability of Hellenistic forms amid political fragmentation. Armenia, under Tigranes II, later known as Tigranes the Great, 95 to 55 BCE, achieved the most notable expansion. Leveraging Seleucid weakness, Tigranes annexed territories in northern Syria and parts of Cilicia, temporarily extending Armenian influence into former Seleucid lands. Ancient sources, including Appian and Plutarch, describe Tigranes' campaigns as strategic, combining diplomacy, marriage alliances, and military conquest. Archaeological evidence in the form of fortified cities, administrative inscriptions, and Greek-language official documents indicates that Hellenistic governance structures were selectively adopted to manage newly acquired territories. Commagene and Cappadocia provide parallel examples of cultural persistence under new dynasties. In Commagene, the monumental sanctuary of Nemrut Dag, constructed under King Antiochus I of Commagene, r. 70 to 38 BCE, combines Greek and Persian iconography, showcasing syncretic religious expression. Reliefs depict Greek gods alongside Iranian deities, while Greek inscriptions record royal dedications and civic benefactions. These sources demonstrate that local rulers intentionally maintained Hellenistic traditions to legitimize authority, integrate diverse populations, and foster civic identity, even while exercising political autonomy. Numismatic evidence reinforces this continuity. Coins from Armenian, Commagenian, and Cappadocian mints feature Greek inscriptions, portraits in Hellenistic style, and iconography reflecting both regional and imperial heritage. By circulating these coins, local monarchs asserted sovereignty while signaling cultural legitimacy, ensuring that Greek urban and religious norms remained influential even outside Seleucid control. Hellenistic cities such as Antioch of Cilicia, Melitene, and Samosata continued to function as administrative and commercial centers under the oversight of these successor dynasties. This period demonstrates the adaptability of Hellenistic governance. Local monarchs selectively incorporated Greek administrative, civic, and religious forms to consolidate power, facilitate trade, and manage multi-ethnic populations. Civic councils, magistracies, and temple institutions were maintained, reflecting continuity with the Seleucid model. Monumental architecture, public inscriptions, and coinage served as tangible reminders of a Hellenistic political idiom, illustrating that culture could persist independently of imperial control. Three interpretive insights emerge from this phase. First, the retention of Hellenistic forms by successor dynasties underscores the resilience of cultural systems even amid political fragmentation. Second, local monarchies exercised pragmatic synthesis, blending Greek, Persian, and indigenous elements to legitimize authority, demonstrating the Seleucid legacy as a flexible template rather than rigid orthodoxy. Third, these polities highlight the dynamics of regional power. As Seleucid's central authority waned, neighbors could expand influence, yet often retained Hellenistic norms to maintain cohesion and facilitate administration. The relationship between these monarchies and the surviving Seleucid state was complex. Diplomatic correspondence, marriage alliances, and temporary military cooperation are documented in surviving inscriptions and Greek historical texts. In some instances, Armenian and Commagenian rulers acknowledged Seleucid suzerainty nominally, while exercising full autonomy in practice. In others, they contested borders, taking advantage of internal Seleucid instability. This fluid interaction illustrates the gradual transformation of the Hellenistic Near East into a mosaic of regional powers, each drawing selectively on inherited cultural and administrative frameworks. By the 1st century BCE, Seleucid Syria represented the final vestige of a once unified empire. Urban centers such as Antioch, Apamea, and Laodicea retained civic structures, Hellenistic culture, and royal patronage. Yet the empire's territorial and political reach had been reduced dramatically. Neighboring monarchies, Armenia, Commagene, Cappadocia, demonstrated that Seleucid institutions could survive in a modified form, providing continuity of culture and governance even in the absence of centralized authority. The persistence of Greek inscriptions, civic councils, and syncretic religious practices across these polities underscores the enduring influence of Hellenistic administration and ideology beyond political collapse. In this context, the Seleucid Empire's legacy became increasingly symbolic. While nominal kings continued to rule Syria, the surrounding region was dominated by emergent dynasties whose policies, coinage, and architecture reflected a selective inheritance of Hellenistic norms. Cultural persistence served both practical and legitimizing purposes. It enabled administration, facilitated trade, and projected authority within multi-ethnic populations. These successor states illustrate how the Seleucid model continued to shape political behavior and civic life in the Near East, even as the empire itself receded from prominence. The throne of Antioch had become a prize without an empire. By the 1st century BCE, Antioch remained the Seleucid capital in name, yet the city exemplified the empire's diminishing coherence. Competing claimants to the throne, most notably Demetrius III Euchirus and Antiochus XII Dionysius, relied less on centralized authority and more on localized alliances. Civic militias and mercenary contingents replaced the once professional royal army, reflecting both fiscal limitations and the erosion of monarchical control. Contemporary inscriptions and papyri reveal frequent petitions from Antiochian officials seeking arbitration or financial support, underscoring the practical fragmentation of governance. Roman intervention increasingly shaped succession and internal politics. Diplomatic correspondence, as recorded by Josephus and Appian, documents Roman attempts to mediate disputes between rival claimants, enforce treaties, and arbitrate territorial claims. This reliance on external arbitration illustrates the Seleucid monarchy's transformation. Kingship was no longer a mechanism for projecting authority, but a contested title contingent on foreign approval. Antiochian elites leveraged Roman influence to stabilize local administration, demonstrating that sovereignty had shifted from imperial structures to city-level negotiation under international supervision. Urban administration itself reflected this decline. Public works, tax collection, and civic ceremonies continued, yet the scale and coordination of earlier Seleucid governance had collapsed. Local councils assumed responsibility for policing, provisioning, and fiscal oversight, effectively substituting for absent royal authority. Archaeological evidence from Antioch, including temporary fortifications and episodic reconstruction layers, indicates recurrent instability and the intermittent presence of competing armies. The city functioned less as an imperial hub than as a contested center of local power. 3 interpretive insights emerge from this period. First, Antioch's condition illustrates the micropolitics of late Seleucid governance. Authority was localized, reactive, and highly contingent. Second, Roman arbitration highlights the externalization of power. The empire survived nominally through diplomacy rather than direct control. Third, the reliance on militia and mercenaries demonstrates how fiscal strain and military decentralization compounded administrative weakness, reducing the monarchy to a symbolic rather than practical institution. By the mid-1st century BCE, Antioch embodied the Seleucid Empire's terminal phase. While royal titulature persisted and civic life endured in truncated form, the city no longer anchored a functioning empire. Authority was fragmented between claimants, local elites, and foreign patrons, foreshadowing the final diplomatic resolution to the Seleucid question. Rome conquered first with treaties, then with time. By the 1st century BCE, the Seleucid Empire had entered a phase of profound vulnerability. Rome, having established dominance over the eastern Mediterranean through successive wars and diplomacy, gradually inserted itself into Seleucid affairs. Treaties, formal correspondence, and envoys, initially presented as instruments of arbitration, functioned increasingly as mechanisms of control. The empire's rulers, weakened by internal strife and fiscal exhaustion, had little choice but to acquiesce. Greek and Roman sources, including Strabo and Appian, emphasize that Roman oversight redefined the exercise of sovereignty. Kingship became contingent on approval from a foreign power rather than the enforcement of internal authority. Roman diplomatic intervention often began with ostensibly neutral arbitration of dynastic disputes. When claimants such as Demetrius III and Antiochus XII contested the throne, Roman envoys mediated settlements, verified territorial boundaries, and endorsed succession agreements. Numismatic evidence supports this influence. Coins issued during this period occasionally depict Roman standards, symbols of military and political authority that implicitly reinforced Rome's role as guarantor. Civic inscriptions in Antioch record payments, oaths, and ceremonial recognition of Roman envoys, indicating the pervasive presence of Roman oversight in what had once been autonomous imperial administration. This subtle encroachment illustrates Rome's broader client-king strategy. Unlike direct annexation, the policy allowed local monarchs to maintain titular authority while curtailing substantive independence. Seleucid rulers were required to conform to Roman expectations in military deployment, treaty enforcement, and territorial management. Appian notes that Rome's approach involved not only political oversight but also manipulation of local succession disputes, ensuring that compliant rulers occupied positions of power. Over time, the cumulative effect was the effective subordination of the Seleucid state without formal conquest. Several systemic consequences emerged from Rome's creeping influence. First, Seleucid diplomacy was increasingly reactive. Kings prioritized Roman favor over internal consolidation, undermining authority in Syria and peripheral territories. Second, the empire's fiscal and military autonomy was restricted. Tribute obligations, as documented in contemporary papyri and inscriptions, diverted revenue previously available for garrisons, civic maintenance, and mercenary payments. Third, public perception of royal authority eroded. Subjects recognized that ultimate decision-making had shifted from Antioch to Rome, further weakening the monarchy's legitimacy. Interpretive analysis reveals the mechanics of soft conquest. Roman envoys acted as arbiters, monitors, and enforcers, embedding imperial influence in administrative and ceremonial practice. By intervening in succession, sanctioning treaties, and symbolically marking coins and inscriptions, Rome converted formal independence into nominal authority. The Seleucid Empire, already constrained by territorial contraction and internal dissension, became a quasi-client state, its rulers navigating external oversight as a prerequisite for survival. This dynamic illustrates how diplomacy, economic leverage, and cultural authority could operate as instruments of control comparable to military occupation. Cultural and economic evidence further underscores the extent of Roman influence. Cities such as Antioch, Apamea, and Laodicea continued Hellenistic civic practices. Yet public rituals increasingly included recognition of Rome. Coinage maintained Greek iconography, but inscriptions and ceremonial honors reflect acknowledgement of Roman supremacy. Trade networks, once largely under Seleucid control, were now mediated through Roman diplomatic channels, aligning economic flows with broader imperial strategy. These markers indicate that even non-military instruments of power, ceremony, currency, and treaties could function as tools of imperial subordination. By the mid-1st century BCE, the cumulative impact of Roman oversight had sealed the Seleucid Empire's fate. Dynastic competition, internal administrative weakness, and external pressures converged under the shadow of Roman power. Seleucid rulers retained formal titles and ceremonial presence, but substantive sovereignty had shifted irrevocably. What remained of the empire's authority was exercised under the watchful eye of Rome, demonstrating that the empire's decline was as much a product of external manipulation as of internal decay. This phase illustrates a broader historical principle. Imperial dominance can be exerted indirectly, through systems of clientage, arbitration, and fiscal leverage. The Seleucid experience demonstrates that loss of sovereignty need not involve immediate conquest. Instead, incremental interventions, treaties, recognition, and oversight can erode independence over decades, leaving a polity nominally intact but politically subordinated. In seeking protection, the Seleucids invited extinction. By the 1st century BCE, the Seleucid state had been reduced to a fragmentary territory centered on Syria, its sovereignty heavily constrained by Roman influence. Dynastic disputes exacerbated instability as rival claimants, including Antiochus III, Philip II, and other minor princes, competed for control of the dwindling monarchy. The chronic internal fragmentation left the throne vulnerable to external intervention. Contemporary sources, such as Appian and Josephus, describe a pattern in which claimants appealed directly to Roman generals for recognition, military support, or mediation, effectively inviting foreign involvement in the resolution of domestic succession crises. Tigranes II of Armenia exploited this weakness to extend his dominion. In 83 BCE, Tigranes occupied much of Syria, including Antioch, creating a client-king arrangement in which Seleucid rulers were reduced to nominal authority. Inscriptions and coinage from this period indicate that Armenian administration assumed the practical functions of governance while retaining Hellenistic forms to ensure continuity among Greek-speaking urban populations. Seleucid princes persisted in name only, dependent on Tigranes' favor and military protection, highlighting the erosion of independent authority. Roman intervention soon followed. The campaigns of Pompey 64 to 63 BCE decisively ended Seleucid autonomy. Pompey negotiated with Tigranes and residual Seleucid claimants, reorganizing Syria as a Roman province. Archaeological and textual evidence, including Strabo's geographic accounts and contemporary Roman records, document the establishment of new administrative structures aligned with Roman provincial governance. Seleucid coins ceased to circulate as markers of sovereignty, replaced by provincial currency reflecting Roman oversight. Cities such as Antioch retained civic identity, yet political authority was now entirely external, subordinated to the imperium of Rome. This sequence illustrates a broader systemic principle. Internal fragmentation creates openings for external powers to assert authority. Dynastic competition, succession crises, and reliance on foreign support transformed internal disputes into instruments of conquest. By appealing to Rome, Seleucid princes effectively relinquished the last vestiges of autonomy, demonstrating how diplomatic entanglement can accelerate political absorption. Numismatic and inscriptional evidence supports this observation, showing a transition from Seleucid symbols of kingship to markers reflecting foreign sovereignty and provincial administration. Three interpretive insights are apparent. First, the decline of central authority allowed regional powers, like Armenia under Tigranes, to act as de facto controllers of Seleucid territory, highlighting the interplay between domestic weakness and external opportunism. Second, Roman intervention represents the final stage of a long process in which diplomacy, arbitration, and military presence supplanted formal independence. Third, cultural continuity persisted even under foreign occupation. Greek civic institutions, urban planning, and religious practice remained active, showing that the Hellenistic legacy could endure independent of political control. By 63 BCE, the Seleucid Empire, once a transcontinental Hellenistic state, had ceased to exist as a political entity. Roman provincial administration replaced Seleucid governance, Tigranes' occupation ended, and surviving Seleucid princes were marginalized or executed. Yet, the Seleucid name persisted culturally and symbolically. Coinage, inscriptions, and architectural forms continued to reflect Hellenistic norms, illustrating the empire's enduring influence even in the absence of political authority. This final phase of Seleucid history underscores the interdependence of internal cohesion, external diplomacy, and military strength. When dynastic rivals relied on foreign powers to resolve succession, they effectively invited the erosion of sovereignty. The Seleucid case demonstrates that political extinction can result not only from military defeat but from the cumulative effects of internal division, external intervention, and systemic administrative weakness. An empire ended. Its cities remained. The Seleucid Empire officially ceased to exist with Pompey's annexation of Syria in 63 BCE. Antioch, once the capital of a transcontinental Hellenistic realm, was reorganized as a Roman provincial center. Numismatic sequences documenting Seleucid kingship abruptly terminate, signaling the definitive end of the dynasty's political authority. Coins bearing the portraits of Antiochus III or other late Seleucid princes vanish from the archaeological record, replaced by Roman provincial issues that aligned currency with new imperial oversight. Similarly, inscriptions and royal decrees, previously issued under Seleucid authority, now reflect the administrative hierarchy of the Roman governor, demonstrating the transition from Hellenistic sovereignty to provincial governance. Despite the disappearance of the Seleucid monarchy, many of the empire's institutions and urban structures persisted. Cities such as Antioch, Apamea, and Laodicea retained their civic councils, gymnasia, theaters, and urban layouts, which had been carefully developed over 2 centuries. Archaeological excavations reveal that Hellenistic urban planning, grid layouts, public agoras, aqueducts, and defensive walls continued to structure daily life under Roman administration. Local elites, often Greek-speaking or Hellenized indigenous notables, maintained municipal offices, collected taxes, and oversaw public works, preserving the practical functions of Seleucid governance in a new political context. Cultural continuity extended beyond infrastructure. Religious and civic institutions adapted to the new order while retaining Hellenistic features. Temples, altars, and civic sanctuaries continued to host festivals and ceremonies in Greek style, and inscriptions indicate that magistrates and priesthoods adhered to familiar civic protocols. Hellenistic art, architecture, and urban symbolism remained visible, underscoring the empire's lasting imprint on the social and cultural fabric of the region. The administrative and civic innovations of the Seleucid period had become embedded in local practice, demonstrating that political collapse did not immediately erase institutional and cultural frameworks. Several interpretive insights emerge from this final stage. First, the survival of urban institutions illustrates that empires can leave enduring infrastructural and bureaucratic legacies, even when sovereignty is extinguished. Second, the continuation of Hellenistic urbanism and civic practice under Roman administration highlights the adaptability of these systems and their ability to coexist with a new imperial framework. Third, the termination of Seleucid coinage and formal kingship emphasizes that political extinction does not equate to cultural disappearance. The Seleucid imprint persisted in everyday governance, urban life, and civic identity. From a broader historical perspective, the fall of the Seleucid dynasty represents a typical pattern in Mediterranean imperial history. Rome, as the emerging hegemon, absorbed the political structures of older Hellenistic states while maintaining the utility of local administration and cultural practices. The Seleucid case exemplifies the integration of prior imperial experience into new frameworks. The Roman provincial system benefited from established Hellenistic urban networks, tax collection methods, and civic organization, which allowed for efficient governance and economic continuity. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Seleucid dynasty had vanished from political maps, but its legacy endured materially, administratively, and culturally. Antioch and other cities remained vibrant centers of Hellenistic life under Roman oversight. Civic councils, religious institutions, and urban infrastructures continued to function, preserving the institutional memory of Seleucid governance. In this sense, the empire's influence did not disappear. It was transformed, integrated, and perpetuated through successive political systems, demonstrating the enduring power of institutional and cultural structures beyond dynastic life. The Seleucid example underscores a central lesson in imperial history. Political extinction is not synonymous with societal erasure. While kingship, military command, and centralized authority were eliminated, the empire's civic, cultural, and administrative innovations persisted, shaping the Mediterranean world for generations. In examining the end of the Seleucid dynasty, historians gain insight not only into the mechanisms of imperial collapse but also into the resilience and adaptability of Hellenistic institutions within a broader historical continuum. Empires seldom fall in battle, they unravel from within. Following the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BCE, the Seleucid Empire entered a period of protracted fragmentation. The loss of key western and northern territories, combined with lingering dynastic rivalries, destabilized central authority. Babylonian chronicles and administrative papyri reveal a pattern of rapidly alternating kings, many of whom reigned only briefly before being deposed, assassinated, or replaced. The resultant political volatility undermined continuity in governance, eroding both the central bureaucracy and the cohesion of provincial administrations. Fiscal exhaustion compounded the empire's instability. Tribute obligations imposed by Rome after Apamea, coupled with persistent military expenditures to secure remaining frontiers, placed immense strain on the treasury. Archaeological evidence from Antioch, Apamea, and Seleucia on the Tigris demonstrates a reduction in large-scale public works and fortification maintenance, indicating financial limitations that hindered effective statecraft. Local elites, facing delayed or inadequate royal support, increasingly managed taxation, garrisoning, and judicial authority autonomously, further fragmenting centralized control. Military overstretch exacerbated these structural weaknesses. The empire's eastern and western borders remained contested, requiring the allocation of forces across vast territories. Campaigns against Parthia, Armenia, and rebellious satraps diverted resources from core provinces, leaving cities like Antioch, Apamea, and Laodicea vulnerable to internal unrest. Epigraphic and archaeological records of temporary fortifications and mercenary deployments suggest reliance on ad hoc defensive measures, rather than permanent, centrally coordinated strategies. The fragmentation of military authority allowed local commanders and militias to assert greater autonomy, weakening the ability of the monarchy to project authority effectively. Dynastic intrigue further accelerated disintegration. Factional competition among royal siblings and court officials created cycles of deposition and restoration, often mediated by external powers such as Rome or neighboring client kings. Babylonian chronicles, Greek historians, and numismatic sequences reflect the instability. Rapid changes in coinage inscriptions denote frequent transfers of legitimacy, while contemporaneous letters and dedications record shifting patronage networks. The combination of court intrigue, fiscal strain, and overstretched military obligations produced a feedback loop in which governance became reactive rather than strategic. Local separatism crystallized these structural vulnerabilities. Semi-autonomous provinces in the eastern satrapies, including Media, Babylonia, and eventually Parthia and Bactria, asserted independence or aligned with emergent regional powers. Inscriptions, administrative tablets, and coinage illustrate the gradual replacement of Seleucid authority with new local regimes. The empire's geographic extent contracted as the state lost its wealthiest and most strategically important territories, reducing its capacity for revenue generation, military recruitment, and internal cohesion. Several interpretive observations emerge from this phase of disintegration. First, the collapse demonstrates that sustained imperial authority depends on integrated fiscal, military, and bureaucratic systems. When any of these pillars weaken, through external pressure, mismanagement, or succession crises, the empire becomes vulnerable to internal fragmentation. Second, dynastic competition illustrates the human dimension of structural decay. Personal ambitions, factional rivalries, and familial disputes had tangible effects on administrative stability and territorial control. Third, the Seleucid experience shows that imperial disintegration is often incremental rather than sudden, characterized by protracted erosion of authority across multiple fronts. Even in this period of decline, Seleucid institutions persisted in shaping successor systems. Greek language administration, urban councils, coinage standards, and civic rituals continued to operate in reduced form, seeding the foundations of later Hellenistic-influenced polities, such as Armenia, Commagene, and Cappadocia. Cities maintained urban layouts, fortifications, and public amenities reflecting Seleucid precedent, illustrating that institutional and cultural frameworks can outlast the political structures that created them. By the mid-1st century BCE, the cumulative effects of internal fragmentation, fiscal exhaustion, and military overextension had left the Seleucid monarchy a shadow of its former power. Authority was nominal, territorial control limited, and dynastic continuity uncertain. Yet the administrative and cultural infrastructure of the empire persisted, demonstrating that while political entities may collapse, the legacies of governance, urbanism, and cultural synthesis endure. Cities remembered what kings forgot. As the Seleucid monarchy waned, its former cities adapted to new political realities, demonstrating remarkable resilience. Urban centers such as Antioch, Apamea, Laodicea, Palmyra, and Edessa retained their civic frameworks even as sovereignty shifted to Parthian or Roman authorities. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence reveals that municipal councils, magistracies, and administrative procedures continued functioning, often unaltered, despite changes in imperial overlordship. Greek civic institutions, agoras, gymnasia, and civic temples remained central to urban life, reflecting the enduring influence of Seleucid governance on the local social and political landscape. In Palmyra, inscriptions record city councils managing taxation, construction projects, and religious observances under Roman oversight. These municipal records demonstrate that local elites retained practical authority and civic responsibility, bridging the gap between imperial directives and the daily needs of inhabitants. Similarly, in Edessa, Greek language inscriptions reveal continuity in public decrees and dedication ceremonies, even as the city fell under the influence of neighboring client kings or emerging Parthian interests. The persistence of civic frameworks facilitated social cohesion and maintained administrative efficiency amid regional instability. Adaptation to new rulers was pragmatic rather than symbolic. Cities maintained Greek-based administrative structures while integrating directives from Parthian satraps or Roman governors. Coinage, taxation, and legal procedures were often harmonized with the policies of the new authority, yet local councils continued to exercise significant discretion in daily governance. Archaeological strata show ongoing urban development, fortifications, public buildings, and infrastructure projects, indicating that city leaders actively managed continuity even as political authority shifted. This period illustrates the durability of Seleucid institutional design. Greek civic models, originally implemented to consolidate empire-wide control, proved flexible, capable of functioning under diverse rulers and adapting to external pressures. Local elites acted as intermediaries between imperial powers and urban populations, preserving civic order and administrative competence. In doing so, these cities became centers of continuity, maintaining Hellenistic culture, law, and urban practice despite the absence of a centralized Seleucid state. 3 interpretive insights emerge. First, the persistence of civic institutions shows that urban resilience can outlast dynastic power. Cities were not merely passive subjects but active agents in governance. Second, the adaptability of Greek frameworks demonstrates their pragmatic efficacy. They facilitated administration across successive imperial systems, from Seleucid to Parthian to Roman. Third, these examples highlight how cultural and institutional legacies can persist even when political authority is nominal or externally imposed, emphasizing the distinction between sovereignty and administrative functionality. By the 1st century BCE, the former Seleucid heartland had become a mosaic of client kingdoms, Roman provinces, and Parthian territories. Yet Greek civic culture, embedded in municipal institutions, maintained continuity across these transformations. The experience of cities like Palmyra and Edessa underscores that the Seleucid model of urban governance, combining local autonomy with centralized oversight, had enduring utility, providing a template for cities navigating imperial transition. The Seleucid legacy in these fragmented regions was thus less about kingship or empire and more about enduring systems of civic organization and cultural infrastructure. Even after political authority vanished, urban populations could rely on familiar administrative structures to maintain taxation, public works, religious observances, and local justice. In this way, the Seleucid experience offers a case study in the resilience of institutional frameworks amid systemic collapse. When power faded, culture endured. Even as Seleucid political authority disintegrated, the cultural and intellectual infrastructures established under their reign persisted across successor regimes. Greek education, administrative practices, and architectural forms continued to structure urban life in Syria, Mesopotamia, and the former Eastern satrapies. Schools, libraries, and philosophical circles maintained curricula in Greek language, rhetoric, and mathematics, ensuring that Hellenistic knowledge was transmitted to subsequent generations. Archaeological evidence from cities such as Antioch and Dur shows continued use of public spaces for education and civic discourse, reflecting the Seleucid emphasis on urban culture and intellectual engagement. Architectural and urbanistic legacies also endured. Grid-based city planning, civic agoras, theaters, and monumental temples remained active under Parthian and Roman administration. Excavations at Palmyra, Edessa, and Apamea reveal that public buildings originally constructed under Seleucid patronage continued to serve social, religious, and administrative functions. Even in newly conquered or client territories, the built environment preserved Hellenistic principles of urban design, combining Greek aesthetics with local traditions, providing a durable framework for governance and cultural continuity. Administration and bureaucratic techniques established by the Seleucids further reinforced cultural persistence. Greek language records, coinage standards, and municipal councils persisted, facilitating continuity in taxation, legal proceedings, and civic management. These systems were readily adapted by Parthian satraps and later Roman provincial governors, demonstrating that Seleucid innovations in governance were not merely imperial instruments but functional tools that transcended dynastic change. Epigraphic evidence attests to continued use of Greek terminology, civic titles, and ceremonial forms, illustrating the durability of Hellenistic administrative culture. The intellectual influence of Seleucid centers extended far beyond the Mediterranean. Greek philosophical, scientific, and literary works preserved in Seleucid libraries and transmitted through urban networks later informed Byzantine scholarship and, centuries afterward, Islamic learning in the Near East. Texts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, originating or collected in Seleucid cities, served as conduits for cross-cultural knowledge exchange, underscoring the empire's role as a mediator between Hellenistic and Eastern intellectual traditions. Seleucid urban cosmopolitanism thus outlived imperial borders, creating networks of learning and civic practice that shaped subsequent civilizations. Three interpretive insights emerge from this period of cultural continuity. First, the endurance of Greek education and civic institutions demonstrates that the Seleucid legacy was structural as well as symbolic. It provided enduring frameworks for governance, social organization, and knowledge transmission. Second, architectural and urbanistic persistence illustrates that Hellenistic city planning could accommodate diverse political regimes while maintaining cultural identity. Third, the Seleucid intellectual network highlights the empire's role in the long-term exchange of knowledge across cultures, ensuring that even after political collapse, its influence shaped both classical and Eastern civilizations. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Seleucid dynasty had vanished as a political entity, yet its cultural imprint remained potent. Greek civic norms, architectural designs, administrative practices, and scholarly traditions persisted in urban centers throughout Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Near East. These continuities provided a foundation upon which Parthian, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic societies would build, demonstrating that the Seleucid Empire's enduring significance lay as much in its intellectual and cultural contributions as in its political achievements. The Seleucid experience, therefore, exemplifies the persistence of civilization beyond the lifespan of political institutions. While kings, armies, and dynasties may vanish, the networks of knowledge, urban planning, and cultural practice they cultivate can endure, shaping the contours of later societies. In this way, the empire's cosmopolitanism, administrative ingenuity, and intellectual legacy outlived its territorial dominion, influencing the development of classical, Near Eastern, and later Islamic worlds. Though its kings vanished, their cities spoke Greek for centuries. The Seleucid Empire, at its height, extended Hellenistic culture far into the heart of Asia, leaving a legacy that outlived its political institutions. Through deliberate policies of urbanization, colonization, and cultural patronage, the Seleucids implanted Greek language, civic structures, artistic conventions, and religious practices across a vast and ethnically diverse territory. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Ai Khanum in Bactria, Dura-Europos along the Euphrates, and Seleucia on the Tigris demonstrates the depth and durability of this cultural diffusion. These settlements reveal grid-based urban layouts, gymnasia, theaters, and temples consistent with Greek civic models, superimposed on local architectural traditions, illustrating how Hellenistic urban planning merged with indigenous forms to create enduring cosmopolitan centers. Greek language and administration became prominent in public and private life across the Seleucid East. Inscriptions and papyri from Ai Khanum, Nisa, and Dura record decrees, contracts, and dedicatory texts in Greek, showing the adoption of Greek as the medium of law, governance, and cultural expression. Coinage reinforced this linguistic and cultural continuity, bearing Hellenistic iconography while circulating widely across Central Asia. By standardizing Greek as the administrative lingua franca, the Seleucids facilitated communication and governance across geographically and ethnically diverse provinces, ensuring that Hellenistic norms persisted even under subsequent Parthian or Roman rule. Artistic influence was equally significant. Reliefs, sculptures, and decorative motifs discovered at Duropos and Ai Khanum demonstrate Greek stylistic conventions in civic, religious, and funerary contexts. Architectural ornamentation, columnar orders, and sculptural themes adapted to local religious practices, creating a syncretic visual culture. This blend of Greek and indigenous forms shaped the aesthetic vocabulary of later Parthian cities and influenced the visual culture of Mesopotamia for centuries. Seleucid artistic policies, often intended to assert legitimacy and Hellenistic identity, thus produced a legacy that transcended the dynasty's political life. Urban institutions facilitated long-term cultural endurance. Cities served as hubs of administration, commerce, and intellectual activity, embedding Hellenistic practices within everyday life. Civic councils, magistracies, and educational institutions provided continuity in governance, law, and social organization. The combination of Greek-style urban planning with functional municipal structures ensured that these cities could persist under successive empires, including Parthian and Roman administrations, retaining elements of Seleucid culture while accommodating new political realities. Several interpretive insights emerge from the evidence of Eastern Hellenism. First, the Seleucid Empire demonstrates the capacity of urban and cultural infrastructure to project influence far beyond the reach of political authority. Second, the integration of Greek language, art, and governance into local contexts illustrates the adaptability of Hellenistic culture and its appeal to a diverse population. Third, these cultural patterns provided a model for subsequent empires. Parthian rulers adopted Hellenistic urban frameworks and administrative practices, while Roman authorities in Syria and Mesopotamia relied on the organizational legacy established by Seleucid cities to govern efficiently. Trade networks and intellectual exchange further amplified Seleucid cultural influence. The royal road and riverine transport along the Tigris and Euphrates enabled movement of goods, ideas, and scholars. Texts in philosophy, science, and literature circulated from the Seleucid East to the Mediterranean, while artisans and architects transmitted techniques across regions. These flows fostered an enduring Hellenistic intellectual network that continued to shape scientific and philosophical traditions in both the classical and Near Eastern worlds. By the 1st century BCE, even as Seleucid political authority had vanished, the imprint of Hellenism persisted in urban form, language, art, and administrative practice. Cities like Ai Khanum, Duropos, and Antioch remained centers of Greek-influenced civic life, and their structures informed the urban planning of later Parthian, Sasanian, and early Islamic cities. The Seleucid legacy demonstrates that empire building is as much about cultural diffusion and institutional durability as it is about territorial control or military conquest. The Seleucid example underscores a key principle in the study of imperial history. The endurance of culture and institutional frameworks can far outlast dynastic or political power. Greek language, urban planning, artistic conventions, and administrative practices established under Seleucid rule continued to shape societies in the Near East long after the last Seleucid king disappeared from history. In this way, the Seleucid Empire's influence extended across centuries, leaving a lasting imprint on the development of cities, culture, and governance in the Eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia. The Roman governor's map was once a Seleucid chart. The administrative practices of the Seleucid Empire left a lasting imprint on the governance structures of subsequent empires, particularly Rome. The division of the empire into satrapies under the Seleucids provided a template for provincial organization. Governors oversaw taxation, military obligations, and civic administration, reporting to the central court while maintaining local oversight. Roman provincial districts in Syria, Cilicia, and Asia Minor mirrored this model, employing similar hierarchical delegation and territorial subdivision. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence demonstrates continuity in administrative divisions, with Seleucid-era boundaries often influencing later Roman provincial maps. Local councils and civic assemblies also reflected Hellenistic precedent. Under Seleucid rule, city councils, boule, and magistracies regulated local taxation, public works, and judicial matters, providing continuity between central authority and urban populations. When Rome annexed former Seleucid territories, these assemblies were largely retained, serving as intermediaries between provincial governors and citizens. Inscriptions from Antioch, Apamea, and Laodicea show that Greek civic titles and municipal procedures persisted under Roman oversight, illustrating a direct lineage from Seleucid municipal governance to Roman provincial administration. Fiscal and bureaucratic practices were similarly inherited. Seleucid coinage, tax assessment methods, and record-keeping systems influenced Roman approaches to revenue collection. Standardized coinage facilitated trade and taxation under the Seleucid state. Rome adopted comparable systems in its eastern provinces to integrate local economies with imperial oversight. Documentary papyri, fiscal inscriptions, and coin hoards indicate that many Seleucid-era administrative procedures remained in practice, providing institutional continuity even as sovereignty changed hands. Military organization also contributed to administrative legacy. Seleucid reliance on garrisons, mercenary forces, and frontier fortifications established norms for combining local authority with central oversight. Roman governors in the eastern provinces maintained garrisons and fortified cities using models developed under Seleucid rule, ensuring that military logistics and urban defense remained coordinated with civil administration. The integration of military and bureaucratic structures in Seleucid practice thus informed Roman strategies for provincial governance. Three interpretive insights emerge from this administrative continuity. First, the Seleucid system demonstrates how imperial governance can bridge central authority and local autonomy through structured institutions. Second, the adoption of Seleucid frameworks by Rome illustrates the practical utility of Hellenistic administration, showing that cultural and institutional sophistication can outlast dynastic power. Third, the endurance of these administrative practices highlights the Seleucid role as an intermediary between Eastern and Western bureaucratic traditions, creating a foundation upon which later empires could build. By retaining Seleucid divisions, councils, and bureaucratic procedures, Roman authorities were able to govern effectively across a culturally and geographically complex region. The Seleucid example provided a tested template for reconciling local autonomy with centralized control, facilitating fiscal management, civic participation, and military coordination. In this way, Seleucid administrative innovations became embedded in the governance of the Eastern Mediterranean, ensuring continuity across political transitions. The legacy of Seleucid administration thus extends beyond territorial boundaries or dynastic longevity. It represents a bridge between the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, demonstrating how sophisticated institutional frameworks can influence successive empires. Roman provincial organization, municipal governance, and fiscal systems benefited directly from Seleucid precedents, ensuring that even after the dynasty's political extinction, its innovations continued to shape the structure of empire. In the fragments of forgotten cities, scholars rediscovered the first cosmopolitan empire. Modern scholarship has profoundly reshaped our understanding of the Seleucid Empire, moving beyond older narratives that emphasize decline, decadence, and relentless fragmentation. Archaeological excavations at Ai Khanum in Bactria, Dur Europos on the Euphrates, and Babylon have illuminated the scope and sophistication of Seleucid urbanism, administration, and cultural synthesis. These discoveries reveal an empire that, while politically unstable at times, implemented a deliberate integrative vision, combining Greek and local administrative practices, religious syncretism, and urban planning into a coherent imperial framework. Epigraphic and numismatic evidence provides additional insight into the Seleucid approach to governance and cultural diplomacy. Greek inscriptions, temple dedications, and civic records demonstrate that the dynasty sought legitimacy through both local participation and Hellenistic ideals. Coinage, standardized across distant provinces, reinforced royal authority while disseminating cultural symbols that blended Greek and Eastern motifs. Modern analysis of these artifacts underscores the Seleucids' capacity for cross-cultural administration and the resilience of their institutional designs, challenging earlier interpretations that emphasized only fragmentation and failure. Urban excavations further illuminate the Seleucid emphasis on infrastructure and public life. Sites such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Duropos reveal planned streets, theaters, gymnasia, and administrative buildings that facilitated civic cohesion and cultural transmission. Scholars note that these Hellenistic urban frameworks allowed cities to survive beyond the political collapse of the dynasty, preserving administrative, educational, and economic structures that influenced Parthian, Roman, and later Islamic urban models. In this light, the Seleucid Empire emerges not merely as a military or political entity, but as a mediator of long-term cultural and institutional continuity. Interpretive insights from modern historiography highlight the Seleucid Empire as an early example of systemic globalization. The integration of Eastern and Western cultural elements, combined with standardized administrative systems and expansive trade networks, allowed the empire to connect regions from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Scholars argue that this cosmopolitan vision prefigured later empires in both the East and West, illustrating how cultural, economic, and administrative cohesion can be achieved even over vast and heterogeneous territories. Reevaluations also challenge traditional assumptions about Seleucid decline. While internal factionalism, succession crises, and external pressures undeniably weakened central authority, contemporary evidence emphasizes the empire's enduring influence. Cities, educational institutions, and trade routes maintained Hellenistic practices long after Seleucid kingship ended, revealing that the dynasty's achievements were not erased by political collapse. Modern research reframes the Seleucids as architects of integration, whose urban, administrative, and cultural legacies shaped subsequent empires for centuries. The Seleucid case, therefore, provides a model for understanding the dynamics of pre-modern empire building and cross-cultural governance. By studying both archaeological evidence and historical texts, scholars can reconstruct a nuanced picture of how a state sought to manage diversity, maintain authority, and transmit culture across vast distances. In this sense, the Seleucid Empire becomes a lens through which historians examine processes of urbanization, administrative innovation, cultural syncretism, and long-term institutional endurance. Through contemporary research, the Seleucid Empire is increasingly recognized not as a failed or ephemeral state, but as a transformative force in the ancient world. Its achievements in administration, urbanism, and cultural synthesis demonstrate how empire building can facilitate systemic integration, enduring institutions, and transregional connectivity. Modern scholarship underscores that the Seleucid experience offers critical insights into the evolution of governance, urban life, and cultural exchange in antiquity. Explore the echoes of empire. Subscribe to follow the unfolding stories of ancient civilizations, where every city, coin, and inscription reveals the legacy of human ingenuity. Dive deeper into history with us, and witness how the past continues to shape the world today.